If you were alive in 18th century Britain and hoped to impress at a dinner party, you didn't just show up with witty conversation and a powdered wig. You brought your smile, or rather whatever was left of it. Because in Georgian England, your teeth weren't just for chewing, they were for flexing. A dazzling set of pearly whites wasn't just a sign of good hygiene, though hygiene was, let's be honest, more of a concept than a practice back then. It was a badge of wealth, refinement, and breeding. Clean teeth were fashionable, attractive, and just a little bit suspicious, because oddly enough, too perfect to smile might suggest you were poor, and in Georgian society few things were worse than being poor, except maybe being poor with clean molars. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic why Georgian dentistry was a tragedy with a toothbrush, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. The ideal Georgian aristocrat was a walking contradiction. Powdered face, stained lips from lead-based makeup, and a mouth that looked like it had seen battle. Think of it as the influencer aesthetic of the 1700s. Neat, white, straight teeth were desirable, but only if it was clear you hadn't earned them through hardship. The rich didn't floss. Floss hadn't even been invented, but they did consume ridiculous amounts of sugar, and the results were front and center every time they opened their mouths. Why? Because in a society obsessed with hierarchy and appearances, dental decay was weirdly aspirational. Sugar was a luxury item, imported from the colonies, mainly the Caribbean, where enslaved labor fueled Britain's insatiable sweet tooth. So if you had blackened or missing teeth, it didn't mean you had a bad diet. It meant you could afford a bad diet. Congratulations, you've literally eaten your way into social acceptance. As grotesque as it sounds, tooth decay became a status symbol. Rotten teeth whispered to the world, "I have cake money." And in the Georgian world of powdered noses and brocade suits, cake money talked. In Georgian England, your smile said more than your resume ever could, mainly that you could afford dessert and disaster. Now, to understand how things got this dentally disastrous, we need to talk about sugar. Before the 17th century, sugar was rare and expensive, known mostly as a medicinal item or exotic treat. But by the 18th century, Britain had developed a voracious sweet tooth, and unfortunately for molars everywhere, the British Empire was more than happy to enable it. Sugar plantations in the West Indies, powered by the brutal transatlantic slave trade, flooded Europe with the white stuff. Sugar became not just affordable but fashionable. It wasn't just for tea anymore. It was in pastries, puddings, candies, sauces, even medicine. If you could put sugar in it, the Georgians probably did, and if you couldn't, they still might try. The result? A society whose aristocrats were literally dissolving from the inside out. By the late 1700s, dental disease was so rampant among the elite that portrait painters sometimes took creative liberties. Some were known to touch up teeth in commissioned paintings, sort of like the Photoshop of the powdered wig era, and if your teeth were really unsalvageable, don't worry, you could buy a new smile, but we'll save that horror story for a later chapter. For now, just know that Georgian dental pride didn't necessarily involve keeping your original teeth. Just like wigs, fake smiles were all the rage. While the upper classes were smiling through their sweetened rot, the poor weren't faring much better. Their diets were often starch-heavy and lacking in nutrients, but without the excessive sugar intake of the wealthy, so their teeth didn't rot quite as fast. But they also didn't have access to the expensive solutions of the elite. A toothache in the slums might lead to a knife and a friend who owed you a favor. A toothache in a mansion might lead to your local barber surgeon and a shot of brandy. Ironically, the poor may have had slightly better teeth, but only because they couldn't afford to destroy them in the first place. A tragic twist that surely would have made Georgian poets weep if they weren't already sobbing into their candied figs. So, why did teeth matter so much in Georgian society? Because in a world where everything was curated, your fashion, your furniture, even your handwriting, your teeth were one more canvas for performative elegance. Whether they were rotting from sugar or replaced with ivory, They told a story. And what a strange story it was, of wealth measured in toothaches, of elegance corroded by syrup, and of a society that believed nothing said "I've made it," quite like an upper jaw that had given up. If there's one thing the Georgian era didn't do well, aside from strange laws, equality, and personal space, it was dental hygiene. In fact, if you were born with a full set of teeth in the 1700s, they were already on a countdown to doom the moment you gurgled your first spoonful of honeyed porridge. Georgian dentistry wasn't just a tragedy with a toothbrush, it was a tragedy without one too. Let's be clear, the average Georgian mouth was a bacterial war zone. It was a place where sugar came to party, plaque set up a long-term lease, and cavities were just the warm-up act before full-scale gum disease took over. While we now understand the basic science behind tooth decay, sugar feeds bacteria, bacteria produce acid, acid eats your enamel, the Georgians were working off vibes, rumors, and the occasional guess from someone wearing a powdered wig and holding a jar of leeches. Sugar, of course, was already causing silent mayhem, but sugar alone doesn't account for the sheer audacity of Georgian oral health failures. That honor goes to the complete lack of hygiene knowledge. The idea that teeth should be cleaned regularly was floating around, but it hadn't quite taken root. Some people rubbed their teeth with cloths, others used twigs, a few dabbed at them with crushed herbs. But as for brushing, that required something the Georgians rarely had, a toothbrush. Toothbrushes did exist by the late 1700s, but they were hardly common. The earliest versions were made from bone handles and bristles sourced from pigs, because nothing says fresh breath like scrubbing your molars with hog hair. These brushes were expensive, hard to clean, and about as common in a Georgian household as central heating. Most people, especially the poor, never even saw one, let alone used one. And floss? That was still centuries away from being a thing. If something was stuck between your teeth, your best hope was a fingernail, a toothpick carved from a chicken bone, or the desperate wish that it would dislodge itself during your next meal. With modern toothpaste also missing from the picture, the Georgians improvised. Unfortunately, their solutions were the oral equivalent of curing a headache with a brick to the face. One popular option was brushing with soot. Yes, literal fireplace ash. The logic, if you can call it that, was that since soot was gritty, it would scrape away the bad stuff. What it actually did was erode enamel, turn your mouth into a sandbox, and make you smell like you'd been eating chimney sweep soup. Then there were the shell powders, often made from crushed oyster shells or cuttlefish bones. These were mixed with water or vinegar to form a kind of prehistoric toothpaste/sandblaster. The result? Gums that bled, teeth that scratched, and breath that still smelled like a cheese cellar in July. Perhaps most shockingly, some Georgians turned to snuff as a dental aid. Snuff, for the uninitiated, was finely ground tobacco inhaled through the nose, because why not weaponize every orifice? Some believed rubbing snuff on the gums could treat toothaches, and to be fair, it probably did numb the pain, right before it added a fresh layer of tobacco-induced inflammation to the mix. But hey, at least it distracted them from the real issue. Their mouths were rapidly turning into archaeological dig sites, and all of this was happening in an era where no one knew what germs were. The concept of bacteria wouldn't be fully accepted until long after the Georgian period ended. As far as they were concerned, bad smells caused disease, and humors governed everything from your toothaches to your emotional outbursts. If you had a throbbing molar, it was probably because your black bile was acting up, Mercury was in retrograde, or you hadn't prayed hard enough. Dental hygiene wasn't a science, it was an interpretive dance performed with crushed shells and desperation. Even more confusingly, some Georgians thought toothaches were caused by tiny worms burrowing into the teeth. These mythical toothworms were a holdover from ancient times, but the belief lingered in pockets of rural Britain. People would apply burning oils or hot irons to the tooth in an attempt to drive the worm out. Unsurprisingly, this did little for the worm because it didn't exist, and quite a lot of damage to the patient, who now had a dental abscess and third-degree burns. The overall result was a population with mouths that were both biologically terrifying and socially tolerated. It was common to lose teeth in your 20s. Cavities were shrugged off as inevitable. People walked around with exposed roots, black gums, and breath that could silence an opera house, and no one really batted an eye. It wasn't pretty, but it was normal. Which leads us to the bigger tragedy of Georgian dental horror. They didn't even know it was horror. It was just life. Your teeth came in, they decayed, and they left. Sometimes on their own, sometimes with a little help from a friend and a pair of rusty pliers, but very rarely because you took care of them. Their idea of dental hygiene was to swish with soot and hope for the best. Spoiler, it wasn't the best. If you lived in Georgian England and had a toothache, congratulations, your options ranged somewhere between experimental and life-altering trauma. That's because dentistry, as we understand it today with clinics, degrees, and people who don't smell faintly of livestock, didn't really exist. It wasn't a profession. It was more of a passion project for anyone who owned a set of tools and wasn't currently using them to shoe a horse. So who pulled teeth in the 18th century? Well, practically everyone except actual dentists, because there weren't many of those around. If someone had strong hands and enough free time, you had yourself a tooth expert. It could be your local barber, the village blacksmith, a traveling peddler, or a guy who just looked confident with pliers. You didn't need a license. You needed nerve, a willingness to ignore screaming, and ideally some upper body strength. Let's start with the barbers, who were the multi-tools of Georgian society. You wanted a haircut? Done. A quick shave? Absolutely. A light bloodletting to balance your humours? Why not? Oh, and if your molar was throbbing, well, they had just the thing. Between their razors, lancets, and leeches, barbers were practically one stop short of being emergency rooms. Many even hung out a striped red and white pole to advertise their services, a design which originally symbolized blood and bandages, not chic grooming. Barber surgeons were essentially the Swiss Army knives of pain. Need a boil lanced? A bone reset? A tooth ripped from your skull with a tool designed for opening wine barrels? Step right in. And they didn't just yank out teeth, they relished it. Some offered extraction demonstrations at public fairs, pulling tooth after tooth in front of cheering crowds like dental magicians. A screaming patient was just part of the ambience. But if the local barber was out for lunch or already elbow deep in someone's scalp, you might have to look elsewhere. Enter the blacksmith, the village's favorite supplier of horseshoes, nails, and now, surprisingly, dental services, because nothing says I trust this man with my face like watching him beat molten iron all day. Blacksmiths were valued for their brute strength and access to tools that looked suspiciously like torture devices. And to be fair, most dental extractions in this period were torture, just without the courtesy of an official charge. If a blacksmith could get a horseshoe on a galloping animal, surely he could wrestle a tooth from your face, right? The problem was precision. Blacksmiths were used to working with things that didn't scream or bleed in quite the same way as people. So the end result was often enthusiastic, if not especially clean. You might lose the tooth, you might also lose a chunk of jaw, but at least you wouldn't have to worry about that toothache anymore, or solid food, ever again. Then, if all else failed, there was the butcher, who, if nothing else, had excellent knife skills and a lot of time around bones. Butchers were used to cutting through cartilage and slicing around joints, which made them a strange but occasionally effective option for dental help. Need something severed? They knew their way around a jawbone. Plus, they usually had a steady hand and a high pain threshold. Though unfortunately that threshold was theirs, not yours. Of course, none of these people had any formal dental training. That would have required someone somewhere to agree on what a tooth was, how it worked, and what shouldn't be done to it. In the Georgian era, such knowledge was still being sorted out, usually by someone in France with a microscope and a lot of dead teeth to examine. Until then, anyone with a firm grip and access to metal was fair game. In fact, tooth pulling became such a casual side gig that many vendors added it to their list of services. Traveling salesmen and market hawkers often carried around makeshift dental kits alongside their fish and ribbons. And why not? Pulling teeth was quick, always in demand, and didn't require you to clean up afterward. There were even traveling tooth pullers who made a performance out of it, dressing flamboyantly, cracking jokes, and extracting molars to the sound of fiddles. It was like a music festival, if the music was screaming. Naturally, complications abounded. Teeth weren't always extracted cleanly, roots could be left behind, gums could tear, and infection was a constant uninvited guest. The worst-case scenario? A broken jaw. The even worse-case scenario? Death by blood poisoning. And yet people kept lining up because the pain of a bad tooth was often worse than the risk of medieval dental roulette. And it bears repeating, no one involved in this process was a dentist. That term was still evolving, and the idea of dentistry as a specialized medical field was only just beginning to flicker to life. For the average Georgian, the best-case dental experience involved a shot of gin, a firm friend, and a short prayer. Everything else was bonus. In the Georgian era, you didn't go to the dentist, you went to someone with free time and a firm grip. Whether they trimmed beards, shod horses, or sliced ham was just a detail. If you've ever looked at a dentist's tray and thought, wow, that looks intimidating, then brace yourself for the Georgian version, because their dental tools didn't just look like weapons, they practically moonlighted as them. Georgian dentistry wasn't so much a medical practice as it was a horror genre, and its props would have been right at home in a medieval dungeon or an exceptionally aggressive toolbox. Let's start with the infamous tooth key, arguably the crown jewel of Georgian dental misery. This instrument was designed with all the subtlety of a bar brawl. The tooth key resembled, yes, an actual key, but instead of unlocking doors, it unlocked your molars from your skull with the elegance of a wrench meeting a chicken bone. The dentist, or whoever had the honor of wielding it, would place the clawed end over the tooth, brace the handle against your gum, and then twist, not gently, not delicately. Twist like you're opening a stubborn jam jar. The results were mixed. Sometimes the tooth came out in one piece, other times it shattered like a teacup under a boot. The gum tissue would often rip, neighboring teeth might get dislodged, and the patient understandably screamed as though possessed. It was less oral care and more dental demolition, and if the tooth key wasn't available, or had been bent out of shape during yesterday's marathon extraction session, there were always iron forceps, which looked like the angry cousin of modern pliers. These came in a range of ominous shapes and sizes, none of which matched the patient's actual anatomy. Dentists weren't fitting these to your unique dental profile, they were grabbing whichever set felt lucky and hoping for minimal resistance. Forceps were used to grip the tooth as tightly as possible, no anesthesia of course, followed by a violent yanking motion that required both strength and a certain level of emotional detachment. This was not a graceful procedure. Sometimes teeth wouldn't budge, sometimes they'd snap, sometimes the dentist would slip and chip a completely healthy tooth just trying to get leverage. Georgian extractions were like gambling, high risk, low reward, and always painful. And then there were screw extractors, which sound suspicious and for good reason. These devices involved screwing a metal spike directly into the offending tooth, then cranking it upward like you were raising a sail on a cursed pirate ship. They were slow, excruciating, and came with a real chance of dragging your jaw along for the ride. The screw extractor was the dental equivalent of a medieval rack, only less subtle. The construction of these tools was as brutal as their function. Made entirely of iron or brass, they were heavy, unsanitized, and not even slightly ergonomic. There were no rubber grips, no adjustments, no sleek sterilized finishes. These were instruments built by blacksmiths, not scientists, and they carried all the charm of a battlefield relic. The handle of a tooth key might be carved bone, the claw might be rusted, and maintenance, that mostly meant wiping off the blood and hoping the next mouth was less squeamish. It didn't help that dentists often had several of these tools lined up ready to go because one was never enough. If the tooth key failed, they'd reach for the forceps. If the forceps slipped, in came the screw extractor. This wasn't a plan. It was trial and error, but the kind of error that could leave you with one less tooth and one more trauma. Perhaps the most disturbing part. These tools weren't hidden behind closed doors. In many cases, they were displayed proudly as proof of the dentist's capabilities. A well-worn set of tools meant experience, and experience meant business. Never mind that most of that experience was in brute force and pain tolerance. To make matters worse, these instruments weren't just used on decayed teeth. Georgian dental logic sometimes suggested preemptive removal. Think your tooth might go bad someday? Yank it now and spare yourself the trouble. Got crowded teeth? Let's create some room with a little unnecessary violence. It wasn't about preserving teeth, it was about removing them as fast as possible before they became a problem. This philosophy led to extractions that were hasty, aggressive, and wildly unnecessary by modern standards. In short, Georgian dental tools were not designed with comfort in mind. They were crude, imprecise, and painful by nature, but they got the job done eventually, and in an era where the goal was simply to stop the pain, not preserve the tooth. That was enough. So next time you find yourself nervously eyeing a stainless steel dental pick at your routine checkup, remember, it could be worse. It was worse. Much worse. Imagine a corkscrew mated with a crowbar, and you've got yourself a Georgian dental tool. Close your eyes and picture this. You're sitting in a wooden chair that wobbles slightly every time your foot twitches. There's a man standing over you with a grim expression, a rusted metal instrument in one hand, and a cup of something strong-smelling in the other. The room smells like sweat, tobacco, and impending doom. Welcome to pain relief, Georgian style, where you didn't avoid the agony, you simply tried not to scream louder than your neighbors. In an age where people thought toothaches were a punishment from either God or poorly aligned stars, pain management was less science-based and more grit your teeth and hope you keep them. Anesthesia, in any form we recognize today, didn't exist in Georgian dentistry. The closest you'd get to sedation was either drinking yourself senseless or hoping that losing consciousness from the pain would give you a nice break from reality. Let's talk alcohol, the MVP of Georgian dental coping mechanisms. Gin, brandy, or whatever spirit was strong enough to make your tongue go numb was the go-to numbing agent. If you had time before your appointment, read, ambushed by a barber with pliers, you'd down as much as you could as fast as you could. Of course, this didn't dull the pain so much as make you care slightly less about it. Best case scenario, you vomit and forget where you are. Worst case, you're fully alert, slightly buzzed, and your teeth still come out one by one like piano keys under a butcher's fist. If you couldn't afford alcohol or simply didn't have access, there were other, equally unpleasant options. Biting down on leather straps was common. Not because it helped, but because it gave your jaw something to do besides tremble in terror. Some patients were told to clutch iron rods or wooden sticks and squeeze with all their might, which didn't relieve pain but did distract from the fact that someone was trying to uproot part of your skull with an iron corkscrew. Then, of course, came the physical restraint. Many dental procedures involved tying patients down, yes, actually tying them to chairs, or having assistants hold them still while the dentist got to work. This wasn't for theatrics. It was to prevent flailing limbs from knocking over tools or worse, accidentally stabbing someone. Georgian dentistry was in every sense a contact sport. In rare cases, opium was used, but only if you were extremely wealthy or happened to know someone shady with connections to exotic imports. Even then, dosage was a guessing game, and the risks of accidental overdose were, shall we say, not ideal. So most folks stuck with tried and true methods like screaming, fainting, or entering a zen-like trance of dissociation. The human brain is a marvelous thing, especially when it's doing everything in its power to pretend it's not attached to a mouth in crisis. Some truly unfortunate souls opted to go the cold turkey route. No alcohol, no restraints, no fuss. Just pure, unfiltered agony. This stoicism was often praised, bizarrely, as a mark of character. Georgian society admired endurance, and if you could sit through a dental extraction without sobbing uncontrollably or biting your tongue in half, you earned serious bragging rights, and probably lifelong trauma. Now, let's not forget the role of the audience. In public extractions, which were common at fairs and marketplaces, passers-by often stopped to gawk, cheer, or wince on your behalf. It was like a circus sideshow, only instead of acrobats, you got a man extracting molars like he was trying to pull Excalibur from stone. This is where the quote-worthy line comes in. There was no laughing gas unless you count the bystanders nervously chuckling while you screamed. Gallows humor was the only anesthetic many had access to. Pain was such an expected part of dentistry that many Georgian remedies and how-to manuals didn't even mention it. They simply assumed you'd suffer, much like you assumed rain would fall in England. You didn't question it. You just accepted it like taxes and early gone. And perhaps most tragically, the fear of this pain led many people to simply avoid dentists altogether, waiting until infections ballooned into full-blown facial abscesses or until a single toothache spread rot across their entire jaw. Preventative care was a foreign concept. You didn't go to a dental practitioner until you absolutely had to, usually when you could no longer eat or your screams were scaring the livestock. By the end of the Georgian period, there were whispers of real anesthetics. Ether and nitrous oxide were on the scientific horizon, but for most of the 18th century, the average dental visit remained a waking nightmare powered by booze, bravado, and blind luck. If you thought a trip to the Georgian dentist was bad, wait until you hear about what came after. The dentures. Yes, when your teeth had finally waved the white flag and surrendered to decay, infection, or one too many toffee puddings, your consolation prize was a set of falsies that belonged somewhere between a horror film prop and a taxidermy experiment. Let's start with the basics. Georgian society loved a good smile. White, straight teeth were the filter of the 18th century. Unfortunately, very few mouths could naturally maintain that kind of dental portfolio in an age before toothbrushes, toothpaste, or the understanding that sugar might not be your best friend. So, when the real teeth gave up, it was time to get a set of new ones. Just not yours. Enter the age of passings people dentures. That's not a euphemism. In the early 1800s, there was a booming trade in what were delightfully called Waterloo teeth. After the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, opportunistic scavengers swarmed the battlefield, not to loot wallets or weapons, but to rip teeth from corpses. These freshly harvested molars and incisors were prized for their human authenticity. They were scrubbed, filed, and fitted into ivory or metal plates, then sold to wealthy customers in need of a dazzling grin. So yes, your elegant Georgian hostess might flash you a charming smile, courtesy of a fallen Frenchman. The practice wasn't new to Waterloo. Human teeth had long been recycled from bodies, whether those belonged to executed criminals, the poor, or even people who sold their own teeth to make rent. A thriving second-hand market flourished. It was dentistry meets the black market, and nobody asked too many questions about the original donor. It's grim, but in a society where fashion trumped hygiene, the ethics were an afterthought. Of course, not everyone wanted the whole corpse-to-mouth situation. For those squeamish about wearing someone else's molars, there were alternative materials, though better is a strong word here. Ivory dentures, often carved from hippopotamus, elephant or walrus tusks, were the go-to choice for the rich. But ivory is porous, and over time it absorbed odors and bacteria. The result? Your teeth might sparkle like moonlight, but your breath could drop a horse. George Washington famously wore ivory dentures, not wood, as the myth goes, and by all accounts they were about as comfortable as wearing a mousetrap on your gums. Then came porcelain, introduced in the late 1700s. Initially, this seemed like a technological miracle, durable, white, and impressively tooth-like. But early porcelain dentures were fragile. Biting into anything harder than a grape could shatter your entire upper row. Worse, they gave off a telltale clink when their owner spoke. So Georgian society soon knew to brace themselves when Mrs. Featherstone's voice sounded like fine china in a washing machine. Comfort was, quite frankly, not part of the dental vocabulary. Early dentures were held in place using springs, metal wires, or sometimes sheer willpower. Many required you to constantly clench your jaw just to keep them from rocketing out during a sentence. Eating was a chore, talking was an exercise in restraint, and smiling, best done gently lest your new teeth stage a dramatic exit mid-ball. And then there were the transitional dentures, part real, part artificial. Sometimes a single ivory tooth would be hammered into a healthy neighboring one using pegs or screws. This created a tooth bridge so structurally unsound, it could only have been dreamed up by someone who thought pain was a form of character building. The most alarming part? These dentures weren't cheap. High-quality false teeth could cost more than a servant's yearly wage, and even the less fragrant options came at a hefty price. That meant many people lived with gaping holes in their mouths, or worse, opted for homemade fixes. Animal bones, stones, or even carved wood sometimes stood in for molars. The results were as horrifying as you'd imagine. Think of it as the DIY dentistry Pinterest doesn't want you to see. And let's not forget the ever-charming denture cleaning rituals. Since toothpaste was more fantasy than fact, most people relied on a concoction of charcoal, vinegar, or even urine to scrub their dentures clean. Yes, you read that right. P. Georgian dentistry never missed an opportunity to be both painful and disgusting. In short, if your Georgian-era friend flashed you a brilliant white smile, there was a good chance you were looking at the dental equivalent of Frankenstein's monster, part gone soldier, part walrus, possibly soaked in urine and held together by rusting wires and regret. When your molar was screaming louder than a town crier on market day, and you couldn't afford the neighborhood blacksmith to yank it out, there was always the thrilling world of Georgian DIY dentistry, do it yourself. In this case didn't mean crafty or clever. It meant you, your cousin, a candle, and a sense of misplaced confidence. Georgian home remedies were equal parts superstition, desperation, and sheer audacity, often resulting in pain relief only if you lost consciousness first. One of the go-to options was clove oil. To be fair, this is one of the very few things Georgians got right. Clove oil does contain eugenol, which can act as a mild anesthetic, but when used as the crown jewel of a dental toolkit that also included whiskey and red-hot metal, it was like bringing a teaspoon to a sword fight. People would soak bits of cloth in the oil and stuff them into cavities or apply it directly to the gum, often while swigging brandy and hoping for a small miracle. Speaking of brandy, alcohol was practically the go-to anesthetic, disinfectant and therapist in one. Toothache? Have a swig. Broken heart? Same remedy. About to pull your own tooth? Better finish the bottle. Whiskey, rum, gin. It didn't matter as long as it was flammable and strong enough to make you forget that your next move involved gripping a pair of tongs with a prayer on your lips. And then there were the people who thought, why not take things up a notch? Enter hot coal. Yes, some truly brave or utterly deranged souls believed that the best way to eliminate the pain was to burn it out. This involved heating a coal in the fire, applying it near or on the tooth, and then regretting every decision that led to that moment. The logic seemed to be, if I replace tooth pain with a third-degree burn, problem solved. If the tooth didn't fall out, the nerve surely gave up and retired early. One lesser-known and more horrifying treatment involved mercury rinses. That's right. People actually swished a neurotoxin around in their mouths thinking it would eliminate the bad vapors or cleanse the gums. And technically, yes, mercury will destroy things, including the user if given enough time. These mercury-based tinctures were sold under the promise of drawing out infection or cleansing the blood, and the Georgians, ever trusting of a man with a coat and some Latin, went all in. If mercury wasn't your vibe, how about urine? Some folk remedies suggested rinsing your mouth with morning urine to relieve toothache. This wasn't uniquely Georgian. People in various periods believed bodily fluids could be repurposed for health. But let's be clear, if your dental care regimen involves peeing in a mug and gargling with it before tea, things have taken a turn. Of course, some Georgians preferred not to mess around with mystery potions and took matters into their own hands, literally. Home extractions were almost a rite of passage. You'd wait until the pain was unbearable, grab a pair of pliers or the fireplace tongs if those weren't available, and have a friend or family member hold your shoulders while you gave it a good yank. It was less a surgical procedure and more a domestic wrestling match with blood. Many of these operations ended in broken teeth, splintered roots, or infections that made the original problem look like a mild inconvenience. And let's not forget the cure, involving tightly tying a string to the offending tooth, attaching the other end to a door, and slamming it shut. Yes, the classic cartoon method. This wasn't just real, it was considered fairly sensible by Georgian DIY standards. No training required, just decent aim and a door with a solid hinge. Adding to the chaos was the thriving business of quacks and miracle peddlers. These were the experts who claimed to have secret cures passed down from mystical monks, ancient druids, or maybe their eccentric uncles. They'd sell powders made of ground coral, elixirs with unknown ingredients, possibly just wine with herbs, or lead-based tooth powders that sparkled your smile straight into a hospital bed. If you were lucky, your toothache didn't improve, but at least your hair didn't fall out yet. These folk cures didn't exist in a vacuum. They were often passed down in families, shared between neighbors, or even printed in domestic advice columns. Books offered up gems like rubbing your gums with raw garlic, painful, spitting on frogs, bizarre, or sleeping with a Bible on your face, ineffective, but probably comforting. In a world where science had yet to show up to the dental party, people filled in the blanks with folklore, fervor, and a dash of what we'll generously call creativity. So next time you hesitate before booking your dentist appointment, remember, the average Georgian household had two things: a fireplace and a dream that the tooth would fall out on its own. And if it didn't, well, you always had fire tongs and whiskey. Georgian England may have had powdered wigs, classical music and candlelit soirees, but behind those polite smiles was a festering dental crisis that could, and frequently did, eliminate you. When a toothache in the 18th century didn't just mean a few days of discomfort, but the very real possibility of dying face first, you begin to understand why people were so terrified of the dentist, or rather the barber with a sharp hook. Let's start with a fun fact. In the Georgian period, gum disease wasn't some minor inconvenience your dentist lectured you about before flossing your soul. It was a progressive, painful condition that could turn into a life-threatening infection faster than you could say abscess. Modern periodontitis causes inflammation and bleeding gums. Georgian periodontitis caused missing teeth, exposed jawbones, facial swelling, and a desperate prayer that the pain would either stop or that life would. The absence of any real understanding of bacteria didn't help. They didn't know what a germ was, but they were certainly full of them. What we now recognize as bacterial infections were simply referred to as bad humors, and there was very little one could do once an infection set in. A dental abscess, a buildup of pus caused by infection at the root of the tooth, was a ticking time bomb in your mouth. When left untreated, which it usually was, it could spread into the jaw, the neck, the bloodstream, or the brain, and it often did spread. Imagine you have a rotting molar. It's painful. Your face is starting to swell. Maybe there's a fever. You're starting to hallucinate. The barber's best advice is to drain it with a heated poker or lance it with a blade that's also used to trim someone's beard. You're too weak to protest because by now the infection may have caused sepsis. That's when your body basically gives up on trying to fight and decides to self-destruct instead. If the abscess ruptured in the right, or rather wrong place, it could lead to Ludwig's angina, a condition not named for any royal but which could royally eliminate you. The swelling from this particular kind of infection could block the airway, causing a slow, panicked suffocation. Think death by swollen gums. No one deserves that, not even your most annoying cousin. And then there was osteomyelitis, an infection of the bone itself. Since the jawbone is conveniently located right beneath all those festering roots, it was a prime target. Once infected, it might begin to rot. Georgian medicine, not exactly known for subtlety, might try to remove the infected portion. With what? Whatever was lying around and vaguely knife-shaped. Without antiseptics or antibiotics, there was every chance the cure would only spread the infection further. It wasn't just the lower classes who suffered. Even the wealthy and powdered elite weren't spared. A mouthful of sugar-rotted teeth could be the entry point for something truly lethal. There's a rather gruesome case from the 1700s of a noblewoman who died after her dental abscess migrated behind her eye and into her brain. At first she complained of a headache, then she began having seizures, then she dropped lifeless in her drawing room, still holding a handkerchief soaked in pus. The real tragedy is that even if Georgian medicine had known what was going on, they didn't have the tools to stop it. Penicillin wouldn't be discovered until 1928, over a century too late for millions who died from otherwise treatable infections. Georgian physicians might try leeches, bloodletting or purging to balance the humours, but all these did was make the patient weaker while the bacteria threw a victory party in their bloodstream. In some documented cases, desperate individuals even turned to surgeons to remove the entire jawbone to halt the spread of infection. This was known as a jaw amputation. And no, there was no anesthesia, the survival rate was low, the trauma was high, and the post-op selfies were non-existent. So yes, one rotten tooth could end you, not figuratively, not slowly over decades, but within days or weeks, through an unstoppable chain of infection, swelling, and systemic failure. Georgian society may have known how to waltz, paint portraits, and recite poetry, but when it came to oral health, they were tiptoeing on the edge of oblivion every time they bit into a scone, and the kicker? Most people just accepted it. A toothache was part of life until it wasn't anymore. By the late Georgian era, someone finally looked at the blood-soaked tooth key and the trembling patient and thought, maybe there's a better way. Enter the pioneers of proper dentistry, the ones who thought pulling teeth shouldn't feel like a minor exorcism. The century wasn't exactly teeming with enlightened medical minds, but amidst the chaos of clove oil, battlefield dentures, and amateur tooth yanks, there were a few brave souls who had the audacity to apply logic, education, and an alarming number of diagrams to teeth. Leading this charge was one Pierre Fauchard, a Frenchman who had the radical idea that teeth deserved science, not just strong wrists. Fauchard wasn't your typical 18th century health enthusiast. He didn't moonlight as a wig maker or dabble in leech placements. No, he was one of the first people to treat the mouth like its own little kingdom of complex issues. His landmark work, Le Chirurgien Dentiste, the surgeon dentist, published in 1728, did something shocking. It laid out methods, tools, and theories for dental care based on observation rather than inherited superstition. The man practically invented modern dentistry with a quill and an unsettling number of mouth sketches. Fauchard's book didn't just recommend best practices, it reshaped the dental cosmos. He wrote about fillings, yes, pre-drill style, braces, using gold wire, because why not look fancy while in pain, and even suggested sugar wasn't exactly a tooth's best friend. In a world still bathing in snuff and rinsing with mercury, that last one alone was revolutionary. But let's not pretend everyone welcomed this newfangled education with open arms. Georgian Britain, for all its powdered wigs and Enlightenment thinkers, still had a fondness for tradition, and that included letting your barber yank your molars while humming a sea shanty. Formal dental training took time to catch on, and licensing? Forget about it. You still had more regulation buying cheese than becoming a dental practitioner. Still, the ripple effects began. In cities like London and Edinburgh, medical schools started to take dentistry more seriously. You'd occasionally find surgeons specializing in oral care, learning from continental texts and trying to distance themselves from the blood-splattered amateurs with their questionable hygiene and just drink some gin methodology. Even newspapers and pamphlets started to advertise professional dental services, often with names that sounded vaguely credible, like Surgeon Dentist to His Majesty. Of course, the title might have been self-bestowed, but at least it implied an attempt at professionalism. And to be fair, by the late Georgian period, some practitioners actually knew what they were doing. Imagine walking into a dental parlor and leaving with most of your blood still inside your body. That was progress. We also start to see the emergence of specialized dental tools that looked less like torture instruments and more like the shiny curved implements we cringe at today. Fauchard had already criticized the infamous tooth key, and successors began crafting gentler forceps and retractors. These new tools were meant to preserve gum tissue and minimize breakage, not just yank and hope. Granted, there was still pain, but now it was strategic pain. This era also birthed early attempts at standardized dental education. While formal dental schools wouldn't bloom until the 19th century, late Georgian practitioners began taking on apprentices, studying anatomy, and keeping notes, real notes, not just tally marks scratched into a pub wall. And then there was the rise of dental literature, pamphlets, guides, and treatises that ranged from semi-reliable to utterly bizarre. While Fauchard was the crown jewel of this movement, his ideas trickled down into a broader wave of medical publishing. Even British surgeons began referencing his work, albeit sometimes in mangled, half-translated English. Still, the message was clear. Teeth were no longer just for chewing, they were worth studying. What's perhaps most fascinating is that all this advancement took place alongside the still thriving world of quackery. You could, in the same day, visit a dentist who cleaned your teeth with powdered coral, and then pass a man on the street selling a cure-all elixir made of burnt toast and rat spleen. The Enlightenment was nothing if not an inconsistent glow. By the end of the Georgian era, dentistry was far from perfect, but it had direction, real direction. Gone were the days when having a toothache meant choosing between an unwashed barber or a coal-heated spoon. Now, at least there was the possibility of getting help from someone who had read a book instead of just seen a tooth once. The long, winding road from superstition to science had begun, and for the first time in history, your molars had a fighting chance. Georgian dentistry was never meant to be inspirational, but somehow it became exactly that. After centuries of butchery disguised as medicine, of blacksmiths doubling as molar marauders, and of patients enduring procedures that would make even a hangman wince, the world finally began to ask, can we do this better? Spoiler alert, we could, and we did, but it took a long bloody road paved with shattered teeth and shredded nerves to get there. The 18th century wasn't just a time of powdered wigs and waistcoats, it was also the era where the seeds of real, thoughtful medicine began to sprout. For all its agony, Georgian dentistry acted as a grim foundation for the dental revolution that would begin in the 19th century. The screams, it turns out, weren't in vain. Let's start with the tools. Georgian dental instruments looked more like medieval siege weaponry than medical equipment. Forceps that resembled metal claws, tooth keys that operated like corkscrews, and extraction methods that required equal parts strength, guesswork, and prayer. But through all that gore and improvisation came insight. Dentists, real ones, started refining these tools, improving designs and materials to make procedures slightly less traumatic. Slowly, the iron monsters evolved into more precise instruments with gentler curves, better grips, and actual logic behind their use. Pain management also began to move out of the tavern and into the clinic. Up until the early 1800s, anesthetic was code for whiskey and fainting spells. Georgian patients might have been lucky to have a friend with a steady hand and a bottle of gin, but their pain laid the groundwork for progress. The recognition of pain as something to be addressed, not just endured, pushed medicine forward. By the mid-19th century, dentists began using ether and nitrous oxide, actual anesthetics that didn't require the patient to be tied to a chair while biting down on a leather strap. You can thank your ancestors for screaming so loudly that someone finally listened. Public health, too, saw a shift. In the Georgian era, sugar had just entered the chat in full force, and mouths across Europe paid the price. Rotting teeth became epidemic, but from this decay came a new awareness of oral health. The sheer scale of dental misery sparked discussions about prevention, hygiene, and eventually education. The toothbrush, once a rare and exotic tool, started making appearances in households. By the Victorian period, they were being mass-produced. And while toothpaste was still hit or miss, coal dust anyone, the idea that brushing one's teeth was a thing worth doing started to stick. Culturally, Georgian dentistry left behind a trail of trauma, folklore, and a very deep-rooted fear of the dental chair. To this day, dental anxiety remains one of the most common phobias, and much of that dread can be traced back to these earlier centuries. When your great-great-great-grandfather was pinned to a table while someone removed a molar with a pair of blacksmith tongs, it tends to echo down the family line. Even modern dental jokes about drills, needles, and that oh-so-relaxing suction tube have their roots in the chaos of Georgian times. But perhaps the most lasting legacy is the idea that dentistry is a profession worth mastering. The emergence of real dentists in the late Georgian period, like Pierre Fauchard and his followers, planted the idea that the mouth deserved its own field of study, that teeth weren't just bones to be yanked, but vital parts of human health. From there, dental schools emerged, best practices formed, and professional standards began to rise from the ashes of amateur agony. In a strange, somewhat twisted way, Georgian dentistry deserves a little credit, not for the horror, but for what it pushed us to become. Every time you recline in a modern dental chair, greeted by a calm, hygienic professional who offers actual pain relief and knows what a toothbrush is, you're enjoying the end product of centuries of suffering. Your 6-month checkup, it's a victory lap over a past that smelled like burnt bone and regret. So next time you're told to floss more or you grimace at the sound of the drill, take a moment to reflect. Georgian dentistry walked so your dentist could gently scold you about plaque. The past may be full of screams, but the future, thankfully, hums along with minty freshness and fluoride. Before clocks, watches, calendar alerts, and that one friend who insists on just 5 more minutes, time was a raw, untamed beast. Ancient humans didn't invent time. Time was already happening, thank you very much. What they did was far more chaotic. They tried to organize it, and in doing so created the world's first group project that nobody could agree on. Imagine being a prehistoric farmer. One day, the sun is warm, the berries are ripe, and the fish practically jump into your hands. The next, your nose has frozen to your own face, and the mammoths are migrating in the opposite direction. Something had clearly changed. The earth wasn't broken, it just had seasons, and thus the first inklings of timekeeping didn't come from science. They came from survival instincts and sheer panic. Let's start in ancient Mesopotamia, because of course we are. These folks looked at the sky and thought, hey, those dots might mean something. The Sumerians around 3000 BCE weren't just the inventors of writing and beer, which should have earned them a statue. They were also early adopters of celestial timekeeping. They noticed the moon had phases. It would appear, wax into a glorious nightlight, then disappear like a teenager avoiding chores. So they created a lunar calendar based on the 29.5-day cycle of the moon. That sounds smart, until you realize 12 lunar months only give you 354 days, which means every year their calendar slid backwards by 11 days. It was like having a birthday that slowly crept toward winter, then back into summer, then into confusion. Their solution? Every few years they'd just toss in an extra month like a bonus sock from the laundry. And this wasn't a rare system. This throw in another month when things feel off method became a classic timekeeping move for centuries. Precision? Optional. Vibes? Essential. Over in Egypt, they took a more solar approach. You see, for the Egyptians, everything revolved around the Nile. It flooded every year like clockwork, except there were no clocks, so they had to figure out how they knew it was about to flood. Their answer? The heliacal rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky. When Sirius reappeared on the horizon, it meant the Nile was about to rise, which meant crops were about to not die. So they built a 365-day calendar, one of the first known solar calendars. No leap year, no adjustment, just 365 days every year. Neat, clean, and almost right. Of course, over centuries, their calendar started drifting away from the seasons. But Egyptians didn't panic. They just assumed the gods were feeling spicy. Meanwhile, in ancient China, timekeeping was part math, part astronomy, and part cosmic bureaucracy. The Chinese lunisolar calendar combined moon phases and the solar year. That sounds elegant, right? Until you realize someone had to constantly recalculate it to make sure everything's still aligned. China's calendar wasn't just for marking time, it was a tool. Each new emperor could start a new era calendar. Imagine if every time we had an election, we reset the calendar. Happy year one of President Greg. That's how it felt in China. Combine that with astrological signs, 60-year cycles and seasonal festivals, and you had a system so complex that entire government departments were created just to make sure people knew what month it was. Also, they used water clocks, literal pots with tiny drips, measuring time by how fast they filled, just like coffee-fueled office workers waiting for the pot to finish brewing, only with more dragons involved. And now we journey across the ocean to the ancient Mayans, who didn't just track time, they obsessed over it like cosmic accountants. Their calendar system was so advanced you'd think they were scheduling Zoom meetings with the gods. They had multiple calendars, a 260-day ritual calendar, a 365-day solar calendar, and a long count that tracked time in cycles of 5,125 years. Their math was so precise that they could predict solar eclipses without telescopes or social media. The truth is, early humans didn't try to control time, they just wanted a heads up before the crops died or the winter wolves came knocking. Calendars weren't created to schedule brunch. They were about not dying horribly because you planted your wheat during what turned out to be wolf mating season. Their efforts gave us the foundations of modern timekeeping. Even if their methods were chaotic, wobbly, and based on stars, rivers, and the occasional emergency month. So the next time you complain that your calendar double-booked your dentist and your dog groomer, remember this. At least you're not a Sumerian farmer trying to figure out if your entire harvest just got postponed because the moon ghosted you. If you've ever missed a birthday because you forgot what day it was, congratulations, you have something in common with most of the ancient world. In a time before digital reminders and wall calendars featuring mildly inspirational cats, humans relied on the most obvious recurring nightlight available, the moon. It went away, it came back, and it did so in a rhythm that even the most sleep-deprived Bronze Age farmer could spot. And thus the lunar calendar was born, humanity's first attempt at telling time based on the emotional arc of the moon. A lunar month is roughly 29.5 days, not a problem, unless you're trying to make that fit into a year. 12 lunar months give you about 354 days, solid math, if you're organizing a dance party. Less ideal if you're trying to prevent your crops from freezing or celebrating your harvest festival in the middle of a blizzard. Solar years, unfortunately, don't care about your tidy moon schedule. They trudge along at 365.24 days like an inflexible landlord. And that small difference between the lunar and solar cycles added up alarmingly fast. Some civilizations, however, chose to ride the lunar wave anyway, and what a wave it was. Take the Babylonians, masters of math and astrology. They leaned heavily on the lunar cycle. They could map the moon's behavior with impressive precision. Yet even they had to admit that 12 moons simply didn't get the job done, so they invented the concept of the intercalary month. In simpler terms, whenever the calendar started drifting too far off course, they'd just wedge in an extra month like a well-meaning friend, adding one more dish to an already full potluck. No one wanted it, but everyone knew it was necessary. But this wasn't a fixed event. Babylonian priests and scholars would literally eyeball the calendar and decide whether or not to add an extra month. Imagine trying to plan a wedding when the officiant might randomly declare a surprise month before your big day. It kept people guessing, and it ensured the priesthood had an iron grip on time itself. If nothing else, it was a brilliant way to make sure no one could challenge their authority. After all, they controlled the very flow of time. Now enter the ancient Hebrews. Their calendar, still in religious use today, was also lunisolar. It followed the moon for months but tried to sync with the solar year through a complex cycle involving 7 leap months, added over a 19-year period. This might sound like an algebra problem you'd rather not solve, but it was remarkably elegant in execution. Still, birthdays had a whimsical tendency to migrate through the seasons, like seasonal allergies with a calendar. Religious holidays didn't escape the madness either. Take Passover. It must fall in spring, so the calendar was adjusted accordingly. Some years, people got an extra month of Adar, essentially a time buffer. a calendrical cushion to keep sacred events aligned with the Earth's seasonal schedule. It worked, mostly, but try explaining to your neighbor why there were 2 months named Adar this year, and watch them pretend they suddenly need to water their goats. Then there's the Islamic calendar, boldly and unapologetically lunar. It doesn't bother with solar correction. 12 lunar months, 354 or 355 days a year. End of story. Ramadan, Eid, and other religious observances drift through the solar year with poetic unpredictability. One year, you're fasting during long, hot summer days. A decade later, it's comfortably tucked into winter. It's beautifully consistent in its inconsistency. It's the only calendar where your holiday traditions could require sunscreen one year and a parka the next. The Islamic calendar's refusal to sync with the solar year wasn't just theological, it was intentional. Many early Islamic scholars saw the solar year's adjustments as unnecessary meddling. Time, in their eyes, was sacred in its natural lunar form. If it meant your camel market fell in a snowstorm every few decades, so be it. That was divine design, not a scheduling error. But for everyday life, purely lunar calendars had real consequences. Over time, festivals floated out of season, planting schedules went rogue, and birthdays became moving targets. One year, you were a cozy spring baby. The next, you were born in what felt like Arctic exile. In short, a lunar calendar made the entire year feel like one big choose-your-own-season adventure. And yet, despite the mess, lunar calendars offered a kind of accessibility that solar ones couldn't. You didn't need a telescope or complex math. Just look up, track the moon and start counting. In a world where most people didn't have a pocket sundial or the patience to consult a priest astronomer every morning, that simplicity mattered. The moon didn't need explaining. It showed up whether you were ready or not. Of course, that didn't stop people from arguing about which phase to start counting from. Some said the new crescent marked the beginning of the month. Others swore by the full moon. A few confused philosophers probably insisted the moon was just a big round cheese, and we should let it be. But the important thing is this: lunar calendars, for all their chaos, got the job done for a while. Until humanity decided they wanted a calendar that didn't sneak up on them with extra months or wandering holidays. But that's a headache for another chapter. For now, just know this: if you ever feel like time is slipping through your fingers, you're not alone. Entire civilizations felt the same way, and they were using the moon as their guide, hoping it wouldn't gaslight them into celebrating New Year's in what felt like August. If you've ever looked at February 29 and thought, "This day feels cursed," you can thank Julius Caesar, a man so powerful he didn't just conquer Gaul, he conquered time itself. Before Caesar restructured the Roman calendar, the situation was less organized empire and more temporal dumpster fire. It was like trying to schedule meetings with a sundial taped to a spinning chariot. The Roman calendar, before Caesar's intervention, was an absolute mess. It was based on the moon, but not in a consistent let's track lunar cycles with some dignity kind of way. The Romans had a 355-day year, which, as we've already learned, is about 10 days too short. To patch this hole, they'd occasionally throw in an extra month called Mercedonius. And when did this extra month happen? Well, whenever the high priests felt like it. That's not a joke. The pontifices, Rome's elite timekeepers, would insert a bonus month whenever they decided things were getting too off track. Naturally, this power was immediately abused. If you controlled the calendar, you could literally manipulate time. Extend an ally's term? Easy. Shorten your enemy's reign? No problem. Delay elections or rush them forward. Consider it done. The calendar became less a tool for managing the year and more a toy for Rome's most ambitious schemers. Time wasn't a construct, it was a conspiracy. By the time Julius Caesar took over as Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief time boss, Timime, the calendar was drifting so badly that seasonal festivals were falling in the wrong seasons. Imagine celebrating a spring fertility festival while harvesting grapes in autumn. That's how backwards it had gotten. The calendar was off by about 90 days, 3 whole months. Rome was basically running a seasonal scam. So in 46 BCE, Caesar decided to hit the reset button hard. He called in the big brains, including an Alexandrian astronomer named Sosigenes, and together they built a new system based on the solar year, 365 days. It was a clean, consistent calendar. None of this add a month when we feel chaotic business. But before the new calendar could begin, they had to fix the damage already done. And how do you fix a calendar that's 3 months off? You add 90 days to the year. Yes, the year 46 BCE had 445 days. Historians call it the year of confusion, and it's possibly the only time in history when absolutely everyone agreed the year needed to end already. Imagine explaining to your boss that this year just isn't over yet, not for another few extra months. Once that temporal chaos was behind them, Caesar introduced his gleaming new time machine, the Julian calendar. It had 365 days a year with an extra day added every 4 years, what we now know as the leap year. This was revolutionary. It kept the seasons and festivals on track, was mathematically stable, and most importantly, it removed the priesthood's shady grip on time. Finally, a calendar that ran on logic, not personal vendettas and moon-based vibes. And yet, like every brilliant Roman idea, it came with quirks. Caesar's calendar added 1 leap day every 4 years, but because the actual solar year is slightly less than 365 day P22, if you're being annoying about it, that tiny fraction built up. Over the centuries, the Julian calendar began to drift again, at a rate of about 1 day every 128 years. It wasn't immediate, but Caesar had essentially installed a time bomb that wouldn't explode until the Renaissance. Still, at the time it was a marvel, a standardized, mostly accurate calendar that the Roman Empire spread across Europe, North Africa, and parts of Asia. And because the Roman Empire had a tendency to show up everywhere with swords and superior plumbing, the Julian calendar became the standard for centuries. But there's something oddly poetic about Caesar's calendar legacy. He was assassinated in 44 BCE, just 2 years after unleashing his big reform. He never got to enjoy the fruits of his orderly calendar. The man who rebooted time like a toga-wearing IT specialist got unplugged before seeing it fully work. Also worth noting, the month of July? That's Caesar's doing. Originally called Quintilis because it was the 5th month in the old Roman calendar, it was renamed to honor Julius Caesar. That's right, he rewrote the calendar and gave himself a month. And honestly, if you reorganize all of time, naming a month after yourself feels like the least arrogant thing you could do. So next time you glance at your planner or mutter under your breath about February being weird again, remember, the structure holding your year together was built by a man who wore sandals, rewrote time, and got stabbed by his co-workers. And all of us conference call survivors and coffee-fueled planners alike are still living in Caesar's world, 1 365 25-day panic cycle at a time. It's one thing to leave your mark on history, it's another thing to look at a perfectly functional month and say, this shall now be named me. Welcome to the ego-stroking, empire-defining, calendar-contorting world of Roman month naming. If you've ever looked at the word October and thought, shouldn't that be the 8th month? Congratulations. You've stumbled upon one of the most gloriously confusing outcomes of Roman vanity. Let's start with the humble Roman calendar, which in its early form began in March. That's right, March, not January. Why? Because Rome decided spring was a great time to start things, like farming, wars, and backstabbing. So the first months, March, Martius, April, Aprilis, May, Maius, and June, Athunius, lined up nicely with seasons and gods. Then came the numbered months, Quintilis, 5th, September, 7th, October, 8th, November 9th, and December 10th. Logical, neat, Roman enough to wear sandals and stab Caesar. But then Julius Caesar did what any self-respecting dictator would do. He edited time. Not only did he implement the Julian calendar, he took Quintilis, that boring old 5th month, and rebranded it as Julius July, because nothing says I've fixed the calendar like putting your name on it like a high schooler tagging a bathroom stall. Julius didn't live long enough to enjoy his month for very long, et tu, brute? But his adopted son Augustus picked up where he left off. Not to be outdone, Augustus renamed it Augustus, August. Why? Well, apparently it was the month of his most glorious military victories, triumphs, and successful propaganda campaigns. But also, maybe he just didn't want his dad to have all the summer fun. Then, to ensure his month wasn't shorter than Julius's, Augustus demanded that August also have 31 days. Cue the great calendar shuffle, where February lost a day like a drunk gambler at a Roman casino. This started a trend where months no longer matched their original numbers. September, which means 7, is now the 9th month. October, 8 is 10th. November and December, 9 and 10 respectively, are now 11 and 12. In short, the last 4 months of the year are basically carrying fake IDs and hoping nobody notices. But wait, it gets pettier. The calendar didn't just become a monument to imperial ego, it became a battleground for power moves. Later emperors tried to get in on the act. Emperor Caligula reportedly wanted a month named after himself, which, based on his track record, probably would have included mandatory horse elections. Nero considered it. Domitian tried it too. Thankfully, the calendar had run out of months and patience. So how did we end up with January and February in the front? That's thanks to an earlier reform by King Numa Pompilius, Rome's second king, who shoved 2 new months in front of March to make the lunar year match the solar cycle better. These months were named for Janus, the god of beginnings and doorways, January, and Februar, a Roman festival of purification, Februar. Congratulations, your month is named after either a transitional portal or a ceremonial sponge bath. Of course, the transition from a logical, numbered calendar to a spaghetti bowl of ego and deities created some long-term problems. School children now have to learn month names that don't match their numbers. Historians have to dig through records like archaeologists with date dyslexia, and everyone, everywhere has to pause when writing out February to make sure they didn't forget the first R. Yet, for all its absurdities, this imperial rebranding left a mark. Literally, every time you check your calendar or book a summer vacation in July or August, you're paying homage to 2 emperors who thought, why just rule Rome when you can also rule time? And let's be honest, it's hard to blame them. If you ruled an empire, wouldn't you name something after yourself? Maybe not a month, but at least a particularly chaotic Tuesday. If you think your modern schedule is chaotic with daylight saving time, time zones, and meetings that could have been emails, spare a thought for the medieval Christian trying to remember whether today was a feast, a fast, or a festival where you couldn't eat meat or do laundry. In medieval Europe, time wasn't just measured, it was sanctified, and you didn't live by a clock so much as you lived by a calendar so full of saints and ceremonies it could double as a liturgical phone book. Welcome to the world of medieval timekeeping, where your planner was basically dictated by the church and God's approval rating was tracked through feast days, saints' anniversaries, and periodic food bans. The medieval Christian calendar was liturgically packed. Every day had a religious meaning. Some days celebrated martyrs who died horribly, others commemorated miracles, and a few were just vaguely pious excuses to throw a festival, ring every church bell in town, and bake large pies in the shape of religious symbols. Time wasn't so much linear as it was seasonal, cyclical, and profoundly holy. If it wasn't Lent, it was Advent. If it wasn't Easter, it was Pentecost. If it wasn't a saint's feast day, it was a day of preparation for the next saint's feast day. Let's talk about feast days. These were the medieval version of holidays, except with significantly more incense and fewer ugly sweaters. Every saint had their own day. Some popular saints, like St. John the Baptist or St. Mary, got major feasts with full church services, elaborate processions, and maybe even a local miracle reenactment if you were lucky. Others, like St. Radegund or St. Swithin, might get more humble celebrations, though humble often still included the expectation to attend Mass, abstain from work, and possibly fast, unless it was a feast involving goose. Then came the movable feasts. These were holy days that refused to stay put, chief among them, Easter. The Church, in all its mathematically adventurous wisdom, decided that Easter would be celebrated on the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox. Translation: good luck knowing when it is without a monk and a moon chart. This lunar logic set off a domino effect once Easter shifted. So did the entire liturgical structure of Lent, Ascension Day, Pentecost, and various minor saints' days. Every year the calendar shuffled like a celestial deck of cards, but it wasn't all feasting and frolicking. The Church was equally committed to fasting. During Lent, meat, dairy, eggs and good cheer were off the menu. Advent, similar restrictions, though with slightly more leniency and considerably less fish soup. Wednesdays and Fridays were also fast days in many places, which meant that if you were trying to plan a wedding or a dinner party, your options were roughly Tuesday. Of course, medieval people weren't consulting iCal or Google Calendar. They had liturgical manuscripts, illustrated books, so richly decorated they looked more like holy comic books than practical planning tools. If you were lucky, your local monastery or cathedral had a detailed calendar that included feast days, saint commemorations and astronomical events. If you were poor or just busy being a peasant, you might rely on your local priest to shout the day's importance from the pulpit, or listen for the pattern of the bells ringing in the church tower. Ah yes, bells, the medieval alarm clock. Monasteries rang bells up to 7 times a day, marking canonical hours like matins pre-dawn, lauds sunrise, terce mid-morning, and vespers evening. Time was divided not by minutes and seconds, but by moments of prayer and reflection. To live near a monastery was to hear your daily schedule clanged out with divine precision. Missed your bell? Too bad. You just accidentally skipped none and are now spiritually out of sync. Time was also incredibly seasonal. The length of an hour could change depending on the season. In summer, daytime hours were longer. In winter, they were shorter. That's right. Hours expanded and contracted like some kind of theological accordion. If you lived in medieval Europe, you didn't ask what time is it. You asked what's the sun doing, and has Brother Cedric rung the bell yet? Even the months themselves were steeped in religious symbolism. February was associated with purification. March might be linked to martyrdom. December was more than just the lead-up to Christmas. It was a spiritual gauntlet of vigils, fasts, and one very long midnight mass. So what was it really like to live under this holy calendar? In a word, unpredictable. You never knew when a local bishop might declare a spontaneous day of fasting for rain, or a pope might announce a jubilee year requiring extra prayers. Time was a sacred rhythm, dictated by Rome, tracked by the stars, and occasionally interrupted by a new saint being canonized because he reportedly turned goats into loaves of bread. In short, medieval calendars weren't about scheduling. They were about spiritual survival. You didn't organize your life around appointments. You arranged it around when to bow, when to abstain from cheese, and when to remember that Saint Swithin was the guy responsible for 40 days of rain. In the grand tradition of historical oops moments, few compare to the great calendar kerfuffle of 1582, when Pope Gregory XIII decided the entire world needed a temporal tune-up, and did it by simply deleting 10 days. That's right. People in certain parts of Europe went to bed on October 4th and woke up on October 15th. If that sounds like the sort of thing that would make you miss your birthday, your rent, and maybe a harvest or two, congratulations, you'd fit right in with 16th century Europeans who were thoroughly justifiably confused. To understand why Pope Gregory XIII had to commit what was essentially chronological vandalism, we need to look at the problem with the Julian calendar, Caesar's system. While a solid improvement in its time wasn't quite precise, it assumed the solar year, the time it takes for the Earth to orbit the Sun, was 365.25 days. So every 4 years a leap day got added. Sounds tidy, right? Except the actual solar year is closer to 365.24, 22 days. That seemingly tiny 11-minute difference per year added up over centuries. And the result? By the 1500s the calendar was off by about 10 full days. Easter, which was supposed to be pegged near the spring equinox, was slowly drifting into summer like a confused picnic. Catholic Church. which had wrapped much of its liturgical schedule, especially Easter, around this celestial timetable, was not thrilled. You can't have your resurrection holiday sliding toward beach season, so Pope Gregory XIII called in the calendar nerds. Chief among them was Aloysius Lilius, a physician and astronomer who came up with a modest proposal: just skip some days. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. To realign the calendar with the solar year, they would drop 10 days, poof, gone. In countries that adopted the Gregorian calendar in 1582, Thursday, October 4th was immediately followed by Friday, October 15th. It was the only time in history when time travelers could claim to have skipped ahead without a flux capacitor. Bakers lost track of their sourdough, chickens forgot how many days they'd been sitting on their eggs, and somewhere, someone was probably still writing October 6th in their diary and wondering why the market was closed. But this wasn't just a one-time disappearing act. The Gregorian calendar also introduced a smarter leap year rule to prevent future time creep. Instead of blindly adding a leap day every 4 years, the new rule was leap years occur every 4 years except in years divisible by 100, unless they're also divisible by 400. So 1600, leap year, 1700, nope, 2000, yes, 2100, sorry, February. The logic here is a mathematical hat tip to the actual solar year's length, shaving off just enough extra time to keep the equinox from wandering again. Now, you might think such a brilliantly engineered system would be immediately embraced worldwide with joyful parades and synchronized watches. Of course not. This is the 16th century, and if there's one thing people didn't do back then, it was agree. Protestant countries, suspicious of anything coming from a pope, initially refused to adopt the new calendar. England and its colonies, yes, including what would become the United States, didn't make the switch until 1752, a full 170 years later. That meant they were still living in the Julian calendar, celebrating Easter in what was, according to the rest of Europe, entirely the wrong month. When England finally caught up, it had to drop 11 days to match everyone else because the Julian drift had continued naturally. Cue the Great British Grumble of 1752. The story goes that angry mobs took to the streets demanding, "Give us our 11 days," a protest that likely didn't happen exactly that way, but the confusion was real. People thought their lives were being shortened. Imagine your boss telling you, "You've had a good year, but unfortunately we've decided to delete 11 days of it. No, you don't get a refund." Despite the chaos and delayed adoption, the Gregorian calendar eventually won the days. Today, it's the most widely used civil calendar on the planet, and we owe it all to a pope, a leap year algorithm, and the collective willingness of nations to occasionally just delete time like a file you swear you didn't mean to have. Progress. That beautiful human instinct to stare change in the face and promptly run the other way. While Pope Gregory XIII had trimmed and tidied up the calendar back in 1582, snipping 10 days from October like a divine editor with a deadline, not everyone was thrilled about taking chronological advice from a Catholic pontiff. In fact, some nations looked at the Gregorian calendar and said, "Nice try, Rome, but we'll stick with our old, slightly broken time machine, thanks." Leading the charge of resistance was none other than Britain, the land of stiff upper lips, afternoon tea, and apparently stubbornly misaligned dates. The Protestant Reformation had already created a theological divide, and the thought of accepting a papist calendar reform was about as appealing to British sensibilities as converting Buckingham Palace into a French café. So while Catholic countries like Spain, Portugal and Italy leapt into the new Gregorian order in 1582 with a shrug and a calendar update, Britain and her empire dug in their timekeeping heels. The logic? If the Pope said jump, Anglican England said, "We'd rather fall slowly." This refusal led to some delightful complications. For starters, dates across borders got messy. Diplomats would arrive at meetings 12 days late or early depending on their home country's religious alignment. Imagine trying to schedule a royal wedding or trade agreement with France while operating on two entirely different calendars. It was less diplomacy, more temporal guesswork. It's amazing Europe didn't just collapse under a heap of mismatched appointment books. Eventually, practicality elbowed its way into British. By the 18th century, the discrepancy had grown to 11 full days, thanks to the Julian calendar's slight but compounding error. Enter the year 1752, when Britain, along with its American colonies, finally agreed to make the leap into modern timekeeping. But like everything British, it wasn't done quietly. The switch was simple on paper. The date would jump from September 2nd, 1752, directly to September 14th. 11 days would simply vanish into the aether, like an unfortunate library book lost behind a couch forever. But to the common folks, many of whom could neither read the paper nor understand orbital mechanics, this wasn't just inconvenient, it was theft, temporal robbery. The government had quite literally taken their days. According to some accounts, though debated by historians, riots broke out. People stormed the streets shouting, "Give us back our 11 days," a phrase that sounds like it belongs in a Monty Python sketch, but is historically rumored to have been shouted with very real torches and very real pitchforks. Others simply found themselves aging almost 2 weeks overnight, which probably made birthday math extremely frustrating. The loss wasn't just emotional, it caused legal chaos. Rent contracts had to be rewritten, wills and debts required recalculation, businesses were unsure whether to charge for the missing days or pretend they'd never existed. It was like trying to bill someone for a dream sequence, and if you think the British colonies handled it better, think again. Across the Atlantic in what would become the United States, colonial governments also had to comply. That meant American colonists, in addition to dealing with taxes and imperial snobbery, now had to deal with the fact that their calendars had gone wonky overnight. Some colonial farmers were convinced their crops would be thrown out of sync as if potatoes could tell time. It's worth noting that not everyone was outraged. Some saw the calendar shift as a bizarre blessing, fewer days of work that month, a free pass from your in-laws' birthday dinner, or a loophole to ghost a bad debt. After all, how can you be expected to pay up on the 9th when it technically never happened? The irony of it all is that while Britain eventually joined the Gregorian parade, it did so with gritted teeth and a headache. But their resistance ensured that the date confusion lingered for centuries. Even today, historians must carefully double-check dates in old documents, often writing old-style Julian or new-style Gregorian, to clarify which reality the poor time traveller has landed in. In the end, Britain's grudging adoption was less a triumph of logic and more a resigned sigh from a nation that realized its timekeeping system was now older and less accurate than that of its European rivals. The revolution wasn't swift, but it was inevitable. Just don't ask them to say Gregorian without a faint grumble. When a revolution hits, everything is up for re-evaluation. Kings, churches, and apparently calendars. Because what better way to say we reject everything about the old regime than by changing what day it is? In the aftermath of earthquakes, a few particularly bold regimes didn't just rewrite laws, they tried to rewrite time itself. And spoiler, it went about as well as you'd expect when bureaucrats try to redesign the week. Let's start with the French Revolution, the ultimate historical new phone who dis moment. After guillotining their way through monarchy and aristocracy, the revolutionaries decided that the Gregorian calendar, steeped in Catholic influence and Roman tradition, was just a bit too monarch-adjacent. So in 1793, they rolled out the French Republican calendar. It was meant to reflect Enlightenment ideals, reason, logic, and naturally, maximum confusion. The revolutionary calendar was ambitious. It had 12 months of 30 days each, neatly divided into 3 10-day weeks called decades. That's right, no more 7-day work weeks. You now worked for 9 days straight and got the 10th off, because nothing screams liberty quite like a 90% work ratio. And just in case you were thinking you could still count on January or March, forget it. The months were renamed based on seasonal phenomena. Vendémiaire was the grape harvest month, Brumaire, the month of fog, and so on, right up through Fructidor, the fruity one. Each day wasn't dedicated to a saint, but to tools, plants, or minerals. so you could celebrate Turnip Day instead of Saint Sebastian. The calendar also eliminated Sunday, which, while it pleased secular thinkers, infuriated the devout. The Catholic Church was not thrilled that its holy day had been deleted and replaced with Primidi, Dirdi, and their dry decimal cousins. Even worse, because the year still had 365 days, the calendar required 5 or 6 extra days at the end of each year, called Sansculotides, a bonus week of celebration named after the Sansculottes, the radical working-class revolutionaries who preferred trousers over aristocratic breeches. These days were meant to be national holidays celebrating virtues like genius, labor, and opinion, but they mostly served as a reminder that the entire system was exhausting to understand. Shockingly, people didn't love it. Farmers couldn't figure out when to plant, peasants missed their weekly day of rest, and bureaucrats tasked with converting all the dates into the new system were caught in a spreadsheet nightmare of historical proportions. Even Napoleon, whose ego could fill 3 calendars, eventually gave up on it. By 1806, the French Republic quietly tiptoed back to the Gregorian calendar, like a teenager sneaking in after a failed house party. But revolutionary France wasn't the only place that tried to shake up timekeeping. In 1929, they introduced the continuous work week. The idea was to keep factories running constantly by abolishing the shared weekend. Instead of all workers resting at the same time, each worker was assigned a rest day on a rotating 5-day schedule. Days were color-coded like a factory rainbow, with each color representing a worker's weekend. Families and friends were often given different days off, meaning that your spouse might be free on red day while you were still stuck grinding through blue. Because who needs synchronized weekends when you can have synchronized loneliness? It didn't go well. Workers hated it. Production didn't really improve, and even the state realized that no one was singing the national anthem about color-coded Tuesdays. By 1931, they tried another version, a 6-day week with everyone resting on the 6th, and by 1940, after a long, painful experiment in total temporal rebranding, they went crawling back to the good old 7-day week like a repentant ex. Both the French experiments proved a vital point. Calendars aren't just tools for marking time. They're deeply tied to culture, religion, social rituals, and even human sanity. Changing the calendar isn't like changing wallpaper. It's more like rearranging the neural wiring of an entire society. And even revolutions can't escape the gravitational pull of tradition forever. So next time you complain about Monday, be grateful it exists. Because in revolutionary France you could have been stuck on Quartidi, the day of time, and in the other one your only holiday might have been the one where you rotate light bulbs while your neighbor gets to nap. If you thought humanity had finally figured out how to measure time after millennia of calendar juggling, skipped days, and emperors playing name tag with the months, think again. In our sleek digital age where atomic clocks tick with maddening precision and your phone can tell you what time it is in Timbuktu, we are still, somehow, making it up as we go. Welcome to the final frontier of calendar confusion, the modern mess of timekeeping. Even in this bold new world of better-aligned Easter celebrations and rent payments, the universe had one more cruel twist to deliver, the leap second. Unlike leap years, which are charmingly predictable, and even come with the occasional presidential election or summer Olympics, leap seconds are irregular and deeply inconvenient. Earth's rotation isn't exactly precise. It's more of a wobbly spin than a well-tuned pirouette. So to keep our atomic clocks and the Earth's actual rotation in sync, scientists sometimes add a leap second at the end of June or December. Sounds harmless, right? Try telling that to the global markets, GPS systems and server farms that run the planet. In 2012, a single leap second caused parts of the internet to crash, flights to be delayed, and tech engineers everywhere to clutch their keyboards and whisper frantic prayers to the silicon gods. The irony: we're adding time to be more accurate, and in doing so, everything breaks. And then there's February 29. If you're born on this elusive date, congratulations, you exist only once every 4 years. Technically, that makes you around 6 years old if you were born in 2000. Legally, Socially and emotionally, it's a minefield. Do you celebrate on February 28, March 1? Do you get half a cake each year? Leap day babies are walking reminders that time is not only bendable, but occasionally skips like a scratched CD. And don't even get started on dating apps and official forms that pretend your birthday doesn't exist. The calendar giveth and the calendar taketh away. Then there's the global headache of time zones. In theory they make sense. Align the hours with the sun's position in the sky. In practice, it's like trying to hold a conversation on a trampoline. Some countries use 30 or even 45-minute offsets. China, a nation that spans 5 time zones, decided to use just one Beijing time, resulting in sunrises at 10 a.m. in some regions. Meanwhile, tiny nations like Nepal proudly boast a time zone that's plus 5:45. It's as if the world collectively agreed that 24 hours wasn't confusing enough. And let's not forget daylight saving time, a yearly ritual where we all pretend to be time travelers. Twice a year, clocks either spring forward or fall back, and no one is ever quite sure what hour it is for at least 3 days. It was supposed to save energy. Now it just costs us sleep, messes with circadian rhythms, and gives late-night comedians annual material. Despite all of this, or maybe because of it, modern society still clings desperately to these systems, patching holes and adding duct tape to the framework of time like nervous carpenters in a crooked house. We invented calendars to organize our lives, but instead we've created a cosmic Rube Goldberg machine that occasionally forgets your birthday and sometimes adds an extra second when no one's looking. So the next time someone tells you to just be on time, remind them that time is a human invention, prone to papal edits, revolutionary resets, and the occasional digital meltdown. We've been bending it, stretching it, deleting it, and renaming it for thousands of years, and we're still not done. Long before stainless steel, silver, or that one drawer in your kitchen where spoons mysteriously disappear, humanity was already scooping, stirring, and slurping its way through the ages. The humble spoon, a tool so essential and overlooked today, actually predates agriculture, pottery, and probably your neighbor's sourdough starter. In fact, archaeologists have uncovered spoon-like utensils going back over 20,000 years, making it older than the wheel, writing, and the concept of paying taxes, which, let's be honest, feels about that old anyway. Prehistoric spoons weren't made of polished silver or gleaming pewter. They were bones, shells, bits of wood, and anything vaguely curved enough to scoop up mammoth stew without burning your fingers. Imagine trying to sip hot reindeer broth from a chipped oyster shell tied to a stick with sinew. That was dinnerware in 18,000 BC, and if you were lucky, your spoon didn't double as your toothbrush. Early spoons weren't just about soup, though. They were tools for survival. Imagine living in a cave and trying to measure out powdered herbs for medicine or drizzle precious melted fat into a cooking fire. Your spoon was a kitchen essential, a pharmacist instrument, and maybe even a ceremonial relic, all in one. Some of the earliest bone spoons discovered in Africa and Europe show evidence of being intentionally carved, smoothed, and shaped. These weren't just tools of necessity. They were also symbols of care, skill, and even aesthetics. You didn't just need a spoon, you needed your spoon. Custom utensils, coming soon to a Paleolithic Etsy near you. Different early civilizations took their spoons in different directions. In ancient Mesopotamia, small carved spoons were used in religious rituals. Spoons not just for soup, but for serving the gods. In ancient China, spoons were long-handled and made from bone or bronze, sometimes etched with designs or inscriptions that suggest these weren't just eating tools, they were status items. The fancier your spoon, the more important you probably were, or at least how fancy you wanted people to think you were. And let's not forget the Egyptians, who weren't content with sticks and stones. They developed elegant spoons from ivory and wood, often shaped into animals, gods, or sacred symbols. Some were too elaborately carved to ever touch food. They were used in religious rites, possibly for scooping sacred oils or perfumes. You know you've made it when your spoon is too holy to stir lentils. Spoons weren't just for dinner. They were for healing and hocus pocus. In many ancient societies, they were used to measure out herbs, oils, and tinctures in primitive medicine, and in some cases, they held spiritual power. Certain African tribes used carved wooden spoons in ceremonies to bless food or ward off illness. Even in prehistoric Europe, spoons may have played a role in rituals, possibly as part of offerings or fortune-telling tools. That's right, before tarot cards, people might have stared at the contents of a spoon and tried to divine the future. I see porridge, and regret. From a certain point on, spoons started becoming more than functional. They became fashionable. In communal societies, having your own spoon was like carrying your favorite coffee thermos today. It meant you had style, status, and at least a small sense of personal hygiene. Not everyone wanted to share a wooden ladle with Cousin Ugg, who chewed on everything. Some nomadic cultures even wore spoons as necklaces, not because they were trendy, but because food was rarely guaranteed, and when it came, you wanted your scooping weapon close at hand. Picture a prehistoric fashion show, fur tunic, mammoth hide boots, and an artisanal antler spoon dangling from your neck like a charm. Think about it. We obsess over fire, the wheel, and the spear, but the spoon quietly got things done. It was the first real utensil, predating forks and knives by thousands of years. While spears were flashy and dangerous, spoons were the ones keeping you fed, one slurp at a time. They might not have conquered empires, but they did conquer stew. And let's be honest, a good stew can make or break a winter. So next time you reach for a spoon, remember that you're gripping 20,000 years of history, a legacy of hungry humans who looked at a snail shell or animal scapula and thought, this would go great with soup. In the grand hierarchy of human invention, the spoon deserves its moment. It may not have the drama of the sword or the fame of the wheel, but in the evolutionary buffet of tools, it's always had one job: getting food to your face, and doing it with style. Long before the silver spoon became a metaphor for inherited wealth, ancient Egyptians were out here scooping porridge like pharaohs with spoons that were practically small sculptures. To the modern eye, they might look like museum pieces or things you'd lock in a glass case, not dunk into a pot of lentils. But in Egypt, spoons were not just for dinner, they were for the gods, for the dead, and for reminding your guests that you were in fact better than them. Egyptians didn't mess around when it came to craftsmanship. Their spoons were carved from ivory, precious woods, stone, and even gold. And no, these weren't hastily whittled sticks from the pantry drawer. These were elaborate, beautiful, downright decadent utensils, sometimes inlaid with semi-precious stones and inscribed with hieroglyphs. Some even had tiny scenes carved into them, fish swimming through lotus flowers, dancing deities or protective symbols to ward off bad spirits, or maybe just bad soup. These weren't the kind of spoons you gave to the kids or used to stir the stew. Many of them were ceremonial, designed to be used during temple rituals or buried with the dead to ensure a stylish afterlife. Egyptians believed in a kind of celestial table service. If you were lucky enough to have your own spoon in this life, you might need it in the next. After all, you wouldn't want to turn up in the afterlife and be handed a chipped communal ladle. And speaking of the dead, tombs have turned out to be some of the best places to find these fancy spoons. Archaeologists have unearthed spoons buried alongside other goods for the afterlife. Jars of food, combs, makeup palettes, and spoons. Sometimes they were symbolic gifts to the gods. Other times they were practical items intended for use in the great banquet of the beyond. Either way, the message was clear: you're taking your cutlery with you because dignity knows no death. There were also spoons used in religious ceremonies, particularly those involving incense, perfumes, or oils. Imagine a priest solemnly scooping sacred myrrh with a delicately carved ivory spoon while standing beneath towering columns etched with hieroglyphs. The spoon wasn't just functional, it was an extension of holiness, a tool of reverence, a divine ladle. Basically, if your spoon didn't look like it had been blessed by Ra himself, were you even a proper high priest? But it wasn't just about religion. Spooning in style also had serious street cred at banquets. Egyptian elites used ornate spoons to serve food at feasts, possibly as a flex, possibly because soup accidents are never dignified when you're wearing linen skirts and gold jewelry. Imagine reclining on a cushion, sipping date wine while delicately lifting a spoon shaped like a papyrus flower. That's not just eating, that's performance art. Some spoons were even designed with animal motifs: ducks, crocodiles, cats, you name it. Whether the animals had symbolic meaning or were simply fashionable is up for debate, but it adds another layer of personality. One can't help but picture an ancient noble showing off their new hippo-handled spoon the way someone today might flaunt the latest iPhone. There's also evidence that spoons had legal and economic significance. In some households, spoons were passed down like heirlooms. They were signed, inscribed, or stamped with ownership marks. That's right, name-engraved spoons were already a thing. And unlike today, where the worst-case scenario is losing your favorite teaspoon to an office kitchen, back then, misplacing a spoon could have meant misplacing a small fortune. All of this adds up to one undeniable truth. In ancient Egypt, the spoon had made it. It had risen from its humble prehistoric roots to become an object of design, reverence, and social symbolism. It scooped, sure, but it also sparkled, sanctified, and strutted. The Egyptians saw spoons as worthy of artistry, spirituality, and even eternal companionship. It was no longer just a tool, it was a testament to culture, class, and cosmic preparation. Because, let's face it, when your spoon is made of gold and carved with the face of a god, you're not just eating, you're experiencing something divine. You're sending a message to everyone at the table and to the afterlife beyond. I came to dine, and I came prepared. When we imagine the glory of ancient Greece and Rome, we often think of soaring marble columns, philosophers in togas, or chariot races that somehow never featured proper seat belts. But nestled within the world of amphorae and aqueducts was a quiet revolution, one that changed the face of dining forever. We're talking, of course, about spoons, and not just any spoons. These were spoons with flair, spoons with purpose, spoons that weren't afraid to poke a snail. Enter the cochlea. No, not the inner ear. The Roman cochlea was a marvel of multi-purpose dining. One end a small round bowl perfect for scooping sauces, grains, or honeyed delicacies. The other end tapering into a thin, pointed tip. What for, you ask? Snails. Obviously, because in a society where toga malfunctions were common and debates lasted days, you simply didn't have time to fight a mollusk with your bare hands. The pointed end made it easy to extract snail meat, apparently a popular snack among the elite, without any awkward fumbling or public embarrassment. Truly, this was the fork before the fork, a spoon with ambition. But the cochlea wasn't just about practical mollusk management. It reflected the broader Greco-Roman obsession with form and function. These were cultures that believed even a salad server should have aesthetic merit. Spoons were made from everything from bronze to silver to the occasional carved bone, often decorated with intricate patterns, etchings, or little figures. Some even came adorned with animals or mythological scenes, as if Hercules himself had blessed your spoon for a truly heroic meal. And the variety, much like how modern humans somehow own 5 different ladles and can't find a single teaspoon when needed, the ancient Romans had different spoons for different foods. There were flatter spoons for soups, deeper ones for porridges, and naturally, the cochlea for snail duty. In essence, they pioneered the idea that your utensil drawer should resemble a poorly labeled museum exhibit. Greek spoons, while less ostentatious than their Roman counterparts, leaned into elegance. They were typically more functional and less decorative, often made of simple bronze or wood. But even the Greeks weren't above a bit of culinary drama. Some of their spoon handles were curved, spiral-shaped, or flattened into artistic designs. Why? Because nothing says civilized society like over-engineering your yogurt scooper. More than just tools, these spoons reflected status. A wealthy Roman might have an entire set crafted from imported silver or fine glass, ready to dazzle dinner guests the moment the olives hit the table. And unlike earlier cultures who buried their finest spoons with the dead, the Romans were happy to keep using theirs until they wore out, or until the family parrot made off with one. In fact, some Roman households had such well-loved spoons that archaeologists have found collections stashed in domestic ruins across the empire, from Pompeii to the farthest reaches of Roman Britain. It seems no Roman wanted to be caught without their trusty cochlea, especially in a world where snails could sneak into any entree uninvited. And yes, there's evidence that spoons were not merely confined to the realm of eating. Some were used for serving condiments, mixing cosmetics, or measuring medicine. A little scoop for your soup, a little jab for your ointment, basically the Swiss Army knife of the ancient cutlery world. But what makes Greco-Roman spoons stand out isn't just their multitasking potential, it's how they bridged utility and identity. In these cultures, the act of dining wasn't merely about sustenance, it was performance, ritual, a social contract sealed with olive oil and awkward reclining. The spoon was your companion in this theatre of manners. It needed to look good while performing admirably under pressure. By the time Rome fell, tragically without a spoon-shaped monument to commemorate its cutlery contributions, the cochlea and its culinary cousins had already made their mark. Later civilizations would take these designs, tweak them, refine them, and eventually mass-produce them with the same enthusiasm we apply to novelty cereal spoons. But make no mistake, the Greeks and Romans weren't just tossing olive pits and discussing Plato, they were refining the future of tableware, one snail skewer at a time. In the medieval world, if it existed, it probably had a prayer attached to it. This was a time when sneezing could warrant a blessing, a thunderstorm could indicate divine wrath, and most intriguingly, a spoon could be considered holy. Yes, while modern humans argue about which drawer the cutlery goes in, medieval Europe was busy elevating the humble spoon to near-divine status, because nothing says devout society quite like an object that can feed both the soul and the soup. Let's begin with the Christian liturgical spoon, used during Holy Communion in the Eastern Orthodox Church. This spoon wasn't for stirring porridge or taste-testing the monastery stew. It was sacred, designed for dispensing consecrated wine and bread into the mouths of parishioners. And we're not talking about your average wooden ladle. These were intricately crafted, often made of gold or silver, and sometimes adorned with crosses or biblical scenes. When your job is to administer the body and blood of Christ, you don't reach for any old teaspoon, you reach for the divine dipper. The logic was simple but reverent. In Eastern Orthodox theology, both the bread and wine are seen as the true body and blood of Christ, so dropping even a crumb or a drop would be a catastrophic spiritual spill. Enter the spoon, a controlled, dignified delivery system that allowed the clergy to perform their sacramental duties without treating Jesus like a clumsy waiter. And then there's the spoon, as in the coronation spoon of British monarchs. You read that correctly. Buried deep in the regalia used during the crowning of kings and queens is an ancient silver-gilt spoon, elegantly narrow with a decorative handle and a bowl split down the middle. It's not for dessert, it's for anointing. This nearly 1,000-year-old spoon, believed to date back to the 12th century, is used to administer holy oil to the monarch during the coronation ceremony. The Archbishop of Canterbury dips the spoon into the oil and anoints the sovereign's hands, chest and head, symbolically setting them apart as divinely chosen. It's basically the medieval version of a royal highlight reel, only instead of a crown montage, it involves sacred condiments. This spoon somehow survived the English Civil War, the destruction of nearly all other royal regalia by Oliver Cromwell's puritanical tidying crew, and centuries of questionable fashion decisions. It remains one of the oldest surviving items in the crown jewels, and if spoons had a hall of fame, it would be enshrined front and center. It is, without question, the holiest item ever to share drawer space with salad tongs. But liturgical spoons weren't just a royal or priestly affair. In monastic communities, spoons could symbolize discipline, humility, and even miraculous intervention. According to legend, Saint Benedict of Nursia, the founder of Western monasticism, once caught a monk sneaking extra rations by using a hidden spoon. Rather than smite the offender with divine wrath, he simply issued stricter dining rules. Apparently, in heaven as on earth, double dipping was a sin. Spoon-related miracles. though rare, were part of the broader tapestry of medieval religious life. There are tales, likely embroidered over centuries, of spoons that healed the sick, appeared in visions, or remained impossibly untarnished despite time or use. One particularly obscure saint, rumored to have served the poor with nothing but a single spoon, supposedly fed hundreds in a miracle, reminiscent of loaves and fishes, though significantly more utensil-focused. Even rules around spoons carried religious weight. Monasteries often dictated exactly when and how spoons could be used. In some stricter orders, monks were forbidden from using metal spoons, as owning a fancy utensil might tempt one toward vanity. Imagine being scolded for having a too flashy soup scoop. In a world where penance was counted in prayers and hunger, that extra shiny spoon might be the path to temptation. In many ways, the sacred spoon reflected the medieval worldview, that everything, no matter how small, could be infused with spiritual meaning. A meal was not merely about nutrition, it was part of a divine order. A spoon could bring comfort, sanctity, or salvation depending on who held it and why. And if it happened to be made of silver and shaped like an angel doing jazz hands, even better. So, while the modern world uses spoons to fish the last bit of yogurt from a plastic cup, medieval Europe might have used the same shape to touch the divine. The next time you stir your tea, take a moment to reflect. Somewhere in a castle, a monastery, or a cathedral, someone once did the same, except they were aiming to crown a king or commune with God. In the courtly chaos of medieval and early modern Europe, wielding a spoon wasn't just a matter of getting stew into your face. It was an elaborate ballet of etiquette, personal branding, and subtle social warfare. Forget jousting. If you wanted to really insult someone at a royal banquet, you sat down and touched the wrong spoon. Let's start with the fact that many nobles, especially in the 15th to 17th centuries, brought their own spoons to feasts, and not just out of hygiene. These weren't simple tools. These were bejeweled, custom-crafted status statements. Gold spoons with family crests, engraved silver with Latin inscriptions, even spoons encrusted with tiny gems. If you rolled into a banquet with a plain wooden spoon, you might as well have shown up in muddy boots and a potato sack. Your spoon spoke volumes about your lineage, your wealth, and your level of commitment to not looking like a peasant. Why the personal spoon? Because communal dining was a dangerous place, socially speaking. In a world without proper place cards or standardized cutlery, utensils were often shared or passed around, but sharing a spoon was more loaded than it sounds. Between upper-class guests, it could mean one of three things. You were a close ally, a romantic interest, or a very confused commoner. Accidentally dipping into someone else's dish with their spoon could ignite a minor scandal. Doing it on purpose? That was practically a proposal or a declaration of war. In royal courts, the seating arrangements alone required a PhD in who hates who and why. Now add spoons to the mix, and you have a battlefield of etiquette. Imagine a long table of tense nobility, each one eyeing the others not for conversation but for cutlery-related offenses. Elbows too wide? Spoon hand hovering too close to the wrong bowl. Heaven forbid you slurp too loudly. That was enough to land you in the doghouse of court gossip for months. This obsession with dining decorum led to a boom in manners manuals. Yes, entire books dedicated to the proper way to hold, pass, clean, and rest your spoon. One 17th century guide warned diners not to lick the bowl of the spoon too greedily, while another cautioned against resting your spoon betwixt thy lips in idle contemplation. In other words, no spoon twirling, no casual clinking, and definitely no daydreaming mid-slurp. If your spoon wasn't being used with precision, you were suspect. There was even advice about spoon-to-soup distance. The elegant diner was expected to dip only from the edge of the bowl, with minimal wrist motion. Scooping from the center, a vulgar move, practically a war crime, and heaven help you if you clinked against the bowl, an offense akin to farting during a toast. But perhaps most fascinating was the custom of gifting spoons as tokens of loyalty or affection. A spoon between friends is trust, wrote one nobleman, which sounds sweet until you realize he probably had to fend off assassins at dinner parties. In fact, spoons could be highly used. Gifting a spoon engraved with your family crest to another house was both a gesture of friendship and a subtle power play. It was like handing someone a bejeweled business card that they'd use to eat pudding. Even among lovers, spoons had coded meaning. If a noble woman handed her suitor a spoon in public, it could be a flirtatious nudge or a full-on relationship reveal. In some cultures, particularly in Wales, elaborately carved love spoons became traditional courting gifts, each curve and symbol carrying a specific meaning. Because what says "I love you" better than "here's a spoon"? Don't share it with anyone else. As the Renaissance bloomed and dining became even more stylized, spoon choreography reached its peak. In high society, it wasn't enough to eat neatly. You had to know when to pick up your spoon, how to hold it with just the right amount of elegance, index finger along the back, naturally, and where to set it down between courses without offending the person next to you. A wrong move could suggest you were a social climber, a foreigner, or worse, a newly rich merchant's son trying to impersonate nobility. Over time, the obsession mellowed a bit. As cutlery sets became more standardized and table manners moved from warfare to mild social critique, spoon etiquette softened. But even today, echoes of those old rules remain. Ever feel weird eating soup with a dessert spoon? You've just triggered the ghost of a 16th century etiquette tutor. Because back in the day, the spoon wasn't just a utensil. It was your weapon, your calling card, and your only defense against broth-based humiliation. If you ever doubted that soup accessories could scream "I'm better than you," then welcome to the Renaissance and Enlightenment eras, where spoons were less about eating and more about economic intimidation. This was the golden, or rather silver, age of cutlery, when having a glimmering spoon tucked into your vest was like flashing a Rolex in the drawing room. A spoon wasn't just a utensil. It was a personality trait. By the 16th century, spoons had transformed from purely functional tools to sparkling social status indicators. The wealthy weren't content with plain pewter or humble wood anymore. No, they wanted gleaming silver, and not just any silver, but sterling silver, sometimes even gilded or inlaid with gemstones. Suddenly, dining became a chance to flex with your spoon doing most of the talking. And it wasn't just a dinner party accessory. Silver spoons made their way into the world of inheritance and matchmaking. Dowries in elite European families often included full sets of fine silverware. If you were marrying off your daughter, you didn't just send her off with a trunk of linens and maybe a goat. You handed over the family spoon set, complete with engravings, twisted stems, and maybe a family crest etched into the bowl, because nothing says marital bliss like soup eaten from the same silver your grandmother used to serve pheasant to the archbishop. The phrase "born with a silver spoon in your mouth" isn't a metaphor pulled from thin air. It's painfully literal. In aristocratic circles, newborns were often gifted their first spoon, solid silver of course, before they'd even had a taste of solid food. Baptism spoons became a real thing too, sometimes engraved with the baby's name and date, making it a sort of glittering ceremonial birth certificate. These spoons weren't for eating strained peas, they were for admiring while trying not to drool on your christening bonnet. During this time, decorative flair became the name of the game. Spoons were twisted like elegant vines, shaped into serpentine curves, or molded into botanical patterns that would make a tulip blush. Some had mother-of-pearl inlays, others had delicate reliefs carved into the bowl, a tiny hunting scene, a cherub, or a moralistic warning that probably ruined your appetite. And let's not forget the engraved initials. Monogrammed spoons were the ultimate blend of utility and ego. If you didn't have your initials carved into your soup implement, were you even trying? These elaborate designs weren't just vanity projects. They were also used to cement alliances. Gifting spoons became an art form. For example, commemorative spoons were handed out during major life events, marriages, births, even deaths. Want to show respect at someone's funeral? Bring a spoon. Want to woo a lady with something more refined than flowers? Give her a silver spoon engraved with both your initials and maybe a suggestive flourish of ivy. Subtlety was for forks. The obsession spread to the merchant class too. As the middle class grew, so did their hunger for social legitimacy, and spoons were a great way to fake it till you made it. Owning a nice set of silverware, especially on display during tea or supper, was like announcing to the room, "Look, I've arrived. Please ignore my uncle still shoeing horses out back." Of course, silver spoons required upkeep. Owning them meant constant polishing, storage in velvet-lined boxes, and a level of anxiety whenever guests with sticky fingers were in the room. But to the upwardly mobile, it was worth the fuss. A polished spoon was the Renaissance version of a spotless kitchen, proof that you had taste, money, and possibly an unhealthy relationship with opulence. By the Enlightenment, entire trades had emerged around crafting, engraving, and selling fancy spoons. Silversmiths became artists, and spoons became their canvases. It was a booming business, and as colonies grew and global trade expanded, so did access to precious metals, meaning even more silverware for the European elite and more envy for everyone else. So yes, in the grand hierarchy of social indicators, a silver spoon wasn't just a tool for eating, it was an emblem of privilege, a badge of beauty, and a shining status symbol that said, without words, "I don't eat stew like a peasant." If there's one thing Europeans loved more than conquering distant lands, it was trying to make everyone eat like them. Enter the spoon, a seemingly innocent utensil turned ambassador of empire. During the age of exploration, colonization, and industrialized ambition, spoons rode shotgun on ships headed to every corner of the world, alongside spices, soldiers, and an alarming amount of tea. Let's rewind to the 17th and 18th centuries, when European powers were busy carving up the globe like a roast at Sunday dinner. Everyone all wanted a piece of the pie, and while they were at it, they brought along their eating habits. Unfortunately for many colonized regions, that meant awkward mealtime culture clashes. Spooning was about to go global, but not everyone was impressed. In many parts of Asia, chopsticks reigned supreme. In South and Southeast Asia, hands were the tools of choice. Dexterous, clean, with proper etiquette, and perfectly suited for the local cuisines. But then came European colonizers, armed not only with muskets and monocles, but with an unshakable belief that their way of eating was the correct way. Cue centuries of table-setting confusion. Imagine a British officer in 1820s India trying to host a formal dinner while silently judging his hosts for not appreciating the proper grip of a dessert spoon. Meanwhile, his local guests were likely wondering why anyone would need a separate utensil just for pudding. Across Africa and the Caribbean, indigenous eating traditions met rigid Victorian dining codes. In some places, spoons were embraced for their convenience. In others, they were politely ignored, and sometimes they were used, but only to serve food, not to consume it. A diplomatic compromise, one might say. But as the global economy began to churn faster, spoons weren't just colonial accessories, they became products. The 18th and especially 19th centuries saw the rise of industrial manufacturing, and with it came the great democratization of cutlery. Once the prized possessions of nobles and heiresses, spoons now rolled off assembly lines in quantities that would make even the greediest soup enthusiast blush. Factories across Europe and the United States began mass-producing flatware in steel, nickel, and silver-plated alloys. Suddenly, the middle class could afford to buy entire matched sets of utensils without having to sell a goat or barter a family heirloom. Retailers like Sheffield in England and Oneida in America became household names, as did the idea that every household should have a tidy drawer full of standardized cutlery. The spoon was no longer a symbol of aristocracy. It was a hallmark of modern civilization, or at least that's how the advertisements put it. This explosion in spoon availability coincided with the expansion of department stores and catalog sales. A woman in Boston could order a complete spoon set with matching teapot and sugar tongs, and have them delivered by train within days. A merchant in Cairo might import inexpensive British flatware to appeal to his upwardly mobile clientele. And in colonies across the globe, imported spoons became tokens of status, modernity, or depending on perspective, cultural erasure. Colonial schooling systems even taught children to use spoons as part of their civilizing curriculum, with mealtimes doubling as etiquette lessons. It wasn't enough to eat, one had to eat properly, which apparently meant holding your spoon like you were conducting a very judgmental orchestra. And while Western powers were busy exporting their cutlery habits, they were also importing exotic designs, Eastern-inspired spoon handles, motifs borrowed from Chinese or Indian art, and hybrid utensil experiments. Hello Spork began to make their way into European markets. It was a confusing era, to be sure, where a teaspoon might come with dragon engravings, or a sugar spoon resembled a lotus leaf. Globalization, it turns out, had a flair for flair. By the late 19th century, spoons were everywhere. They were wedding gifts, company giveaways, baby christening staples, and eventually souvenir collectibles. Yes, someone in 1885 was excited to own a spoon from Niagara Falls. No longer rare, spoons became emblems of a rising consumer culture, affordable, accessible, and ever-present. But amid all this commerce and colonization, the spoon carried more than just soup. It carried ideology. It represented what colonizers believed was refinement. It embodied the Industrial Revolution's promise of abundance, and it served as a quiet tool of assimilation, one bite at a time. So while the British Empire may be remembered for red coats, railroads, and maps aggressively shaded in pink, we'd be remiss not to acknowledge its subtler legacy, spreading spoons to every table it touched, and making sure dinner came with a side of cultural confusion. Of all the cutlery that clinks, clatters, and clangs across our dinner tables, the humble spoon is perhaps the most underappreciated. It's been scooping, stirring, and sipping for millennia, but while the knife flexes its edge, and the fork wields its prongs like a mini trident, the spoon quietly gets the job done without fanfare. It's the utensil world's equivalent of the reliable character actor, never the star, but always indispensable. The spoon's PR problem began the moment forks strutted onto the European table with their scandalous tines and controversial curves. Forks were once considered effeminate, exotic, even devilish. One clergyman in the 11th century reportedly called them an insult to God because they dared to poke his creation. Naturally, the fork's dramatic entrance gave it a certain flair. Knives, meanwhile, were already the darlings of the dining scene, doubling as tools, weapons, and fashion accessories. Your average nobleman might have had more knives than meaningful relationships. And then in the corner was the spoon. It didn't stab, it didn't slice, it didn't twirl pasta into neat little nests, but it did everything else. You can't eat porridge with a fork. You can't sip soup with a knife unless you enjoy second-degree burns and spoonfuls of shame. And yet, because it didn't have an edge or provoke a scandal, the spoon was often dismissed as the safe utensil. You know, the one you give to babies, or invalids, or anyone you don't trust with anything pointy. Yet that very gentleness is the spoon's greatest strength. It's the first utensil we ever encounter, soft, smooth, and forgiving, the gateway to solid food, the bridge between milk and meatballs. It's the childhood companion of every mashed banana, applesauce blob, and mysterious puree your parents claimed was delicious. From the first gurgling attempts at self-feeding to the triumphant discovery of ice cream, spoons are there. And not just for kids. Consider how the spoon features in our moments of vulnerability. Spoons are the go-to for comfort food. Stews, puddings, yogurt straight from the tub after a breakup. They cradle broth when you're sick and gently ferry oatmeal when your throat feels like sandpaper. No one has ever said, "I'm feeling fragile. Hand me a fork." No, you reach for a spoon, the gentle hugger of the utensil drawer. Despite this emotional range, spoons rarely earn any spotlight. No one stages a grand spoon duel. You don't see action heroes dramatically tossing one into the enemy's thigh. And while forks have gone on to inspire musical instruments and knives have inspired, well, crime dramas, the spoon remains metaphorically and literally round-friendly, unthreatening, and thoroughly unflashy, even linguistically. Spoons can't catch a break. A spoonful of sugar sounds sweet but ultimately diminishes the spoon's true capacity for contribution. It's often used as a unit of smallness, something minor. a fraction, just a spoonful. Rarely do we hear about the epic power of a ladle-sized scoop or the noble might of a heaping tablespoon. And have you ever heard someone say they're spoiling themselves with a fancy spoon? Didn't think so, but for all its lack of swagger, the spoon is a silent powerhouse. It transcends cultures more seamlessly than forks or knives. Chopsticks may dominate East Asia, hands may rule the culinary stage in many parts of Africa and the Middle East, but spoons, oh spoons, glide smoothly between curry bowls in India, pho broths in Vietnam, and couscous mounds in Morocco. They've adapted to regional tastes without trying to change the world, they just help you eat it. The spoon is also a culinary multi-tool. Think about it. While forks can twirl and knives can cut, spoons can mix, measure, serve and deliver. They're essential in the kitchen long before they ever hit the table. From stirring cake batter to doling out secret spices, the spoon is both cook and server. It's the sous chef of your dreams. Quiet, competent, and utterly irreplaceable. So why isn't there more spoon appreciation? Where's the Museum of Spoon History? Where's the Spoon Appreciation Society, with annual conventions and collectible lanyards? Where's the blockbuster film where a spoon saves humanity one scoop at a time? The truth is, spoons don't crave the limelight. They never have. They've been around longer than most human civilizations, and they'll still be here long after the last post about artisan forks fades into the void. Spoons aren't flashy, but they're foundational. The unsung heroes of the utensil world, the quiet champions of culinary civilization. And maybe, just maybe, that's the whole point. Not every hero needs a sharp edge or fancy tines. Some just need a good curve, a steady hand, and the ability to cradle your soup without judgment. In a world obsessed with innovation and sleek design, it might come as a surprise that the humble spoon is still thriving. Not as some dusty relic of dinner times past, but as a surprisingly sophisticated piece of modern life. Gone are the days when spoons were carved from bone or beaten from bronze solely for function. Today, they've crossed into the territory of high fashion, intergalactic engineering, and niche collectors' markets that would make even the most eccentric coin hoarder blush. Let's start with the peculiar world of souvenir spoons, a global phenomenon that somehow turned ordinary eating utensils into tiny metallic monuments. From the Eiffel Tower in Paris to a moose head from Alberta, you can find a teaspoon commemorating just about every corner of the earth. These collectible curiosities exploded in popularity in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. With designs so detailed they looked like someone tried to sculpt the entire city of Rome into a teaspoon's handle. Displayed in velvet-lined cases or jammed onto overcrowded kitchen racks, these spoons weren't for eating, they were for flexing. They whispered to guests, "Yes, I went to Niagara Falls and all I got was this disturbingly ornate spoon." Jealous? But don't think modern spoons stop there. Designers in the 21st century have taken spoon aesthetics to places even the ancient Egyptians might raise an eyebrow at. From spoons made of carbon fiber to ones shaped by algorithms for maximum soup efficiency, we are living in the golden age of hyper-intentional scooping. Ergonomics, once a concern limited to office chairs and gaming mice, now governs the curvature of spoon bowls and the balance of handles. There are spoons made specifically for ice cream that conduct your body heat to help melt the dessert, and even spoons designed to make baby food taste slightly sweeter. Turns out the material of the spoon can subtly influence flavor. We're now engineering emotion into cutlery, and then of course there's space. Because if there's one thing humans do better than anything, it's take something deeply ordinary and then make it orbit the earth. Enter the anti-gravity spoon. You might assume that eating in space would be all high-tech food tubes and dehydrated bricks of lasagna, but astronauts still need utensils, just very cleverly designed ones. In microgravity, your soup doesn't sit politely in a bowl. It becomes a rebellious blob with a mind of its own. To combat this, they developed spoons with features that help wrangle floating liquid, sometimes even using Velcro or magnetic features to keep utensils from floating off mid-bite. It's basically spoon cosplayers' sci-fi gear. Meanwhile, back on Earth, Spoons have also found their way into art galleries, fashion shows, and even music studios. Artists have used spoons as sculpture components. Jewelry designers have turned them into bracelets. And yes, there's a musical subculture devoted entirely to playing spoons as percussion instruments. In an ironic twist, the object built to tame soup has become an expressive extension of human creativity. But while some spoons soar among the stars or pose under spotlights, others live quiet, honorable lives in your kitchen drawer. They stir your coffee, ladle your soup, and help you eat cereal when you're too tired to cook anything resembling a grown-up meal. They might not be flashy, but they are the workhorses of modern dining, and frankly the most emotionally comforting utensil out there. No one reaches for a fork when they're down. It's the spoon that gets the job of healing heartbreak with ice cream or delivering medicine with a sayar. Even in a world of robots, molecular gastronomy, and 3D printed meals, the spoon remains both a tool of the everyday and a symbol of human ingenuity across time and gravity. From ancient graves to zero-gravity labs, it has endured, evolved, and adapted, all without losing sight of its single essential purpose: to scoop.